SWAT teams swarmed in before sunrise, guns drawn. What started as a simple gas station shootout during Bike Week unleashed hell on the notorious Mongols Motorcycle Club. Families diving for cover at a gas station turned into 28 arrests, weapons seized, and a clubhouse raid that exposed their secret world. This wasn't just another biker brawl, it was the takedown that shook Florida's criminal underworld to its core. When hell broke loose at a gas station.
All hell then begins to break loose. We're not showing you some of the cell phone video where you could really see and you could really hear the gunshots, and you see people diving for cover, people running across 44, and here the beatdowns begin.
March 8, 2025 was supposed to be just another perfect day during Florida's Bike Week. The sun was shining, tourists were everywhere, and thousands of motorcycles rumbled through the streets of New Smyrna Beach. Families were out enjoying the spectacle, kids pointing excitedly at the endless parade of chrome and leather rolling past their windows. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, everything changed at a racetrack gas station that should have been like any other stop for fuel. Security cameras later showed a group of Warlocks Motorcycle Club members pulling in first, looking calm and casual as they filled up their tanks. They seemed like just regular bikers taking a break from the road, talking among themselves and enjoying the warm weather. But 13 minutes later, when the Mongols arrived at that same gas station, you could practically feel the temperature drop. This wasn't some random encounter between strangers who happened to ride motorcycles. These were two outlaw motorcycle clubs with serious bad blood between them, and everyone present knew it the moment they spotted each other across the fuel pumps. What happened next turned a family-friendly tourist destination into something that looked like a war zone. Voices got louder, tensions escalated, and suddenly gunshots rang out across the gas station. Parents grabbed their children and dove behind cars. Tourists abandoned their vehicles mid-refuel and ran for whatever cover they could find. A 6-year-old who witnessed the violence would still be having nightmares months later. 2 men were shot during the chaos, both surviving their injuries but leaving behind a community that was shaken to its core. This wasn't some back-alley confrontation or late-night bar fight that only affected the people involved. This was broad daylight violence at a busy public location during one of Florida's biggest tourist events. With innocent families caught in the crossfire, the immediate aftermath was chaotic but telling. Instead of scattering like regular criminals might, the bikers from both clubs maintained some semblance of organization, even as police sirens wailed in the distance. Some stayed to tend to the wounded, others coordinated their stories, and a few made calculated decisions about who should leave and who should remain. This wasn't random street violence, it was something much more structured and dangerous. Within hours, law enforcement officers were securing the scene and collecting evidence, but they already knew this wasn't going to be treated like a typical assault case. The public nature of the violence, the organized involvement of 2 motorcycle clubs, and the complete disregard for innocent bystanders had crossed a line that authorities couldn't ignore. What the shooters didn't realize was that those few moments of gunfire had just triggered something much bigger than they could have imagined. The 4-month hunt that nobody saw coming.
But I had to do an interview with members of Mother Chapter and had to get voted in by them too. And the Mother Chapter is the original founding chapter of the club. When I first started the Mongols in Oregon, there was 6 members.
While the gas station was cleaned up and normal life seemed to resume in New Smyrna Beach, something much more serious was happening behind closed doors. Law enforcement wasn't just going to arrest a couple of shooters and call it a day. They were preparing to launch what would become one of the most comprehensive takedowns of an outlaw motorcycle club that Florida had ever seen. For nearly 4 months after the Bike Week shooting, an intense investigation unfolded in complete secrecy. Detectives weren't just reviewing security footage from that one incident. They were building detailed profiles of dozens of Mongols members across the state, mapping their connections, tracking their movements, and documenting their communications. The investigation quickly revealed that this gas station confrontation was just the tip of the iceberg. Digital forensics teams worked around the clock analyzing cell phone records, social media posts, and text messages between known Mongols members before and after the shooting. What they found painted a picture of an organization that operated more like a criminal enterprise than a motorcycle club. Phone records showed extensive communication between members in the hours leading up to the Bike Week confrontation. These weren't casual calls about where to meet for rides. They were strategic conversations about territory, respect, and dealing with rival clubs. Some communications suggested the gas station encounter wasn't entirely spontaneous. There had been planning involved. What they discovered during those months went far beyond the gas station confrontation. Many of the Mongols involved in the Bike Week incident had connections to previous violent incidents across Florida, including shootings in Titusville and Cocoa. Some had extensive criminal histories stretching back years. Others were in the country illegally. What connected them all was their membership in an organization that law enforcement was beginning to understand as much more than just a motorcycle club. Surveillance teams watched as Mongols members held meetings at various locations across Florida. They documented who attended, how long meetings lasted, and what happened afterward. Often violent incidents would follow these gatherings by just days or weeks. The pattern was becoming clear. This wasn't a social club that occasionally got into trouble, but an organized group that used violence as a tool for control and intimidation. Investigators called their operation Mongolian Beef, a name that might sound almost funny until you understand the deadly serious intent behind it. This wasn't going to be a few arrests and some confiscated weapons. This was going to be a coordinated dismantling of an entire criminal network that had brought violence to public spaces filled with innocent people. Financial investigations revealed another layer of the organization's operations. Money was flowing through various accounts in patterns that couldn't be explained by legitimate employment. Some members were receiving regular payments that didn't correspond to any known jobs. Others were making cash deposits that far exceeded their reported income. The financial evidence suggested ongoing criminal enterprise beyond just occasional violence. By late June 2025, investigators had built comprehensive files on dozens of individuals. They knew who the leaders were, who the enforcers were, and who served specific roles within the organization. They had tracked phone calls, analyzed social media posts, and documented patterns of behavior that painted a picture of an organized criminal enterprise operating under the cover of motorcycle enthusiasm. The level of preparation was extraordinary. Officers weren't just planning to show up at random addresses and hope for the best. They knew exactly who lived where, what vehicles they drove, what weapons they likely possessed, and how they were likely to react when confronted by law enforcement. Every detail had been planned and rehearsed multiple times before they ever left their stations on July 2nd. Intelligence gathering extended beyond just the Mongols themselves. Investigators interviewed bartenders, store clerks, gas station attendants, and other community members who had regular contact with club members. These conversations revealed patterns of intimidation, unusual cash transactions, and behaviors that supported the growing case for organized criminal activity. What nobody outside law enforcement knew was that this operation was being coordinated between nearly 200 officers from multiple agencies across several states. The scale of cooperation was unprecedented, and it would soon prove to be the key to the operation's success. The dawn raids that changed everything.
Obviously, game's over, everybody beats feet before the cops get there. Eventually, we're able to identify 7 people that are armed, 4 people who shot. 3 of those 4 people that shot were involved in a shooting last year in Titusville, where they surrounded a group of warlocks on US 1 and opened fire on them. Clint Walker was arrested that day. This morning, we were in Edgewater for Robert Manns, who was a shooter. We took over 20 firearms out of his house, and I can't tell you how much ammunition came out. And then I'm going to have to ask the AG for a favor on this one. I'm going to need a scholarship, if you can give me one, to Alligator Alcatraz, Port Orange resident Carlos Cardona Batista, who was arrested today and who was here in the country illegally. So I don't know if you can get us a scholarship for him, sir, but we would really appreciate that. One of the shocking things that came out of this, I think, was when you wonder why crime is the way it is and how people view things differently. At 7:53 this morning in Virginia,
July 2nd, 2025 began like any other summer morning across Florida. But for 28 members of the Mongols Motorcycle Club, it would be the day their world came crashing down. Operation Mongolian Beef launched with military precision as teams of officers moved simultaneously across multiple counties. The coordination was flawless. While some Mongols were being arrested in Volusia County, others were being taken into custody at the same time in Brevard, Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, and Polk counties. One suspect was even apprehended in Chesterfield County, Virginia. This simultaneous action prevented anyone from warning their associates or destroying evidence. What made these raids particularly effective wasn't just the timing, but the intelligence behind them. Officers knew exactly who they were looking for and where to find them. Some suspects were arrested at their homes while still asleep. Others were taken into custody at work, at restaurants, or during routine activities. The element of surprise was complete. The raids began at 5:30 a.m., sharp across all locations. Teams had been in position for hours, waiting for the synchronized signal to move. Radio communications crackled with updates as each team reported successful arrests. Target 1 secured. Target 5 in custody. Evidence recovered at location 7. The operation unfolded like clockwork. At one location in Brevard County, officers found their target just returning from an overnight trip. The suspect pulled into his driveway to find law enforcement vehicles already positioned around his property. There was no chase, no dramatic confrontation, just the realization that his time had run out. By the time he turned off his motorcycle engine, officers were already approaching with weapons drawn and arrest warrants ready. The evidence seized during these raids painted a disturbing picture of what law enforcement was actually dealing with. Across all locations, officers recovered 38 handguns and 15 long guns, far more firepower than any legitimate motorcycle club would need. Many of these weapons had modifications or filed-off serial numbers, suggesting they were meant for serious criminal activity rather than personal protection. Some locations yielded particularly interesting discoveries. At one residence in Palm Beach County, officers found a sophisticated weapons cache hidden behind a false wall in the garage. The hiding spot was so well constructed that it took nearly an hour to locate, even with detailed intelligence about its existence. Inside were high-capacity magazines, ammunition, and weapons that had been reported stolen from other states. But the weapons were just part of the story. Officers also discovered sophisticated surveillance equipment at several locations, including counter-surveillance tools designed to detect police monitoring. Some members had police scanners, signal jammers, and other technology specifically meant to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. This wasn't paranoia. This was the behavior of people actively engaged in criminal activity. Gang vests with patches indicating specific ranks and roles within the organization were seized, providing investigators with a clear picture of the Mongols' hierarchy in Florida. These weren't just fashion statements. They represented authority, territory, and earned status within a criminal organization that operated like a paramilitary structure. The patches told stories that investigators found fascinating and disturbing. Some indicated specific crimes committed, territories controlled, or enemies defeated. Others showed alliances with criminal organizations in other states or countries. A few bore symbols that only made sense to those deeply embedded in the outlaw motorcycle world, coded messages about loyalty, violence, and criminal achievement. Digital devices recovered during the raids contained communications about club business, territory disputes, and plans for dealing with rival clubs. Some devices held photos and videos that would later prove crucial in connecting individuals to specific criminal activities, including the gas station shooting that had triggered the entire investigation. One particularly valuable find was a tablet belonging to a mid-level member that contained detailed records of club meetings, financial transactions, and communications with other chapters across the country. The device painted a picture of an organization that was far more sophisticated and far-reaching than local law enforcement had initially understood. The financial evidence was equally revealing. Cash, financial records, and ledgers showed money flowing through the organization in ways that couldn't be explained by legitimate means. Some locations had tens of thousands of dollars stored alongside weapons and gang paraphernalia, a combination that raised serious questions about drug trafficking, weapons sales, and other illegal income sources. At one location, investigators discovered a money-counting machine still warm from recent use, suggesting ongoing financial operations that extended well beyond the club's legitimate activities. Nearby ledgers showed transactions involving large sums of cash with cryptic notations that investigators believed referred to drug sales, weapons deals, and protection payments. What law enforcement had uncovered wasn't just a motorcycle club with some bad members. This was an organized criminal enterprise with military-style structure, sophisticated equipment, and significant financial resources. The scope of the operation they had just dismantled was far beyond what most people would have imagined possible. The president who ran the show. Among all the arrests made during Operation Mongolian Beef, one stood out above the rest. Carlos Cardona Batista wasn't just another patch-wearing member of the Mongols. He was the Florida chapter president, the man who authorities believed called the shots for the entire organization throughout the state. When officers arrived at Cardona Batista's residence on the morning of July 2nd, there was no dramatic standoff or high-speed chase. The chapter president surrendered peacefully, perhaps understanding that resistance would only make his situation worse. But what officers found inside his home told a different story about his role in the organization. Several firearms were recovered from his residence, including what appeared to be personal weapons, as well as others potentially meant for distribution to club members. More importantly, documents found at his home suggested direct involvement in planning club activities, including communications that investigators believed were related to the Bike Week confrontation. The documents painted a picture of a man who took his leadership role seriously. Meeting notes in his handwriting detailed decisions about territory disputes, member discipline, and responses to law enforcement pressure. Some notes referenced specific dates and locations that corresponded to violent incidents investigators had been tracking for months. Cardona Batista's background made him particularly interesting to authorities. Unlike many of the other arrested members who had extensive criminal records, he had managed to maintain a relatively clean official history while allegedly orchestrating criminal activities from behind the scenes. This suggested a level of sophistication that worried investigators. He knew how to delegate the riskiest tasks while maintaining control over the organization. Financial records found at his residence revealed the extent of his control over club operations. Bank statements, deposit slips, and financial ledgers showed him receiving and distributing large sums of cash through various accounts. Some transactions appeared to correspond to major criminal activities, while others seemed designed to maintain the appearance of legitimate business operations. His leadership style combined traditional biker culture with modern criminal enterprise management. Under his direction, the club had reportedly expanded its territory in Florida, established relationships with other criminal organizations, and increased membership. He had transformed what might have once been a small group of motorcycle enthusiasts into a significant criminal force in the state. Phone records seized during the raid showed Cardona Batista maintaining contact with Mongols chapters across the country and even internationally. These communications revealed a level of coordination and strategic planning that extended far beyond Florida's borders. He wasn't just running a local chapter, he was managing a significant piece of a national criminal organization. When Cardona Batista appeared for his first court hearing, prosecutors pulled no punches. They described him as the driving force behind the Bike Week violence, arguing that while he might not have fired any shots himself, he had authorized and coordinated the confrontation. They successfully argued for denial of bail, citing both his influence over other members and his potential flight risk. The prosecution's case against him relied heavily on the organizational materials found at his residence. Meeting minutes, financial records, and communications all pointed to a man who wasn't just aware of criminal activities, but actively planning and directing them. His role in the gas station confrontation might have been indirect, but his responsibility for it was clear. The arrest of the chapter president created immediate chaos within the remaining free members of the organization. Without clear leadership from the top, those who hadn't been arrested were left uncertain about how to respond. Some went into hiding, others began exploring cooperation with authorities, and a few reportedly reached out to National Mongols leadership for guidance on how to proceed. For prosecutors, Cardona Batista represented more than just one defendant. He symbolized the organized nature of the violence that had erupted during Bike Week. If they could prove that he had planned or approved the gas station confrontation, it would strengthen their case against every other member arrested in connection with the incident. Intelligence gathered about Cardona Batista revealed a man who had risen through the ranks of the Mongols through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and organizational skill. He understood that successful criminal enterprises required discipline, structure, and strategic thinking. His leadership had transformed the Florida chapter from a minor presence into a major criminal force. But his arrest also sent a message to other outlaw motorcycle clubs operating in Florida. If law enforcement could take down the president of the Mongols so quickly and thoroughly, nobody was untouchable. Other clubs reportedly began changing their operations, becoming more cautious about public gatherings and internal communications. The case against Cardona Batista would ultimately become a test of Florida's legal approach to organized criminal groups. Could someone who wasn't physically present at a violent incident still be held accountable as its organizer and leader? The answer to that question would have implications far beyond this single case. A legal strategy that caught everyone off guard. When it came time to build cases against the arrested Mongols members, Florida prosecutors made a decision that surprised even experienced defense attorneys. Instead of pursuing traditional charges like assault or weapons violations, they turned to a relatively new legal tool that would prove devastatingly effective. Florida's aggravated rioting statute had been designed specifically for situations like the Bike Week incident. Under this law, when a riot involves more than 25 people, includes deadly weapons, causes property damage, or threatens public safety near businesses or traffic, it becomes a second-degree felony carrying up to 15 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. The gas station confrontation met every requirement of this statute. There were dozens of bikers present, firearms were discharged in a public space, innocent bystanders were endangered, and the entire incident occurred at a busy business with vehicles all around. For prosecutors, it was the perfect opportunity to use this law as it was intended. What made this legal strategy so powerful was that prosecutors didn't need to prove who fired which specific shots. Simply being part of the group while armed and participating in the violence was enough under the aggravated rioting statute. This allowed them to cast a much wider net than traditional assault charges would have permitted. The legal precedent they were setting was significant. Previous cases against outlaw motorcycle clubs had often faltered because prosecutors couldn't prove individual participation in specific violent acts. Witnesses would disappear, security footage would be unclear, or physical evidence would be inconclusive. The aggravated rioting approach eliminated many of these problems by focusing on group behavior rather than individual actions. Defense attorneys found themselves caught off guard by this approach. They had prepared for the usual assault and weapons charges that typically follow motorcycle club incidents. Instead, they were facing a statute that treated their clients as part of an organized riot, with penalties that were significantly more severe than they had anticipated. The preparation for these cases was exhaustive. Prosecutors spent months reviewing every piece of evidence seized during the raids, looking for connections between individual defendants and the broader criminal enterprise. They built detailed timelines showing how decisions made at club meetings translated into violent actions on the streets. The legal strategy extended beyond just the criminal charges. Prosecutors also used civil forfeiture laws to target the Mongols' assets, including properties like the Edgewater Clubhouse that they argued had been used for planning criminal activity. This two-pronged approach, criminal charges against individuals and civil actions against their assets, was designed to completely dismantle the club's presence in Florida. Civil forfeiture proceedings moved on a separate legal track, allowing authorities to seize property even before criminal convictions were secured. The clubhouse, bank accounts, vehicles, and other assets connected to the organization were frozen, effectively cutting off funding for legal defenses and preventing the club from regrouping financially. When it came to bail hearings, prosecutors used the aggravated rioting charges to argue for high bond amounts or denial of bail entirely. They presented evidence showing not just participation in the gas station incident, but patterns of behavior suggesting ongoing criminal activity. Judges generally agreed, setting bail at amounts ranging from $100,000 to $500,000, with some defendants denied bail completely. The high bail amounts served multiple purposes. They kept dangerous individuals off the streets while cases proceeded, but they also applied financial pressure that made some defendants more willing to consider cooperation agreements. Members who couldn't afford bail found themselves isolated from their support networks and facing the full weight of potential prison sentences. For the Mongols members sitting in jail awaiting trial, the reality of their situation was stark. This wasn't going to be handled like previous arrests they might have experienced. The aggravated rioting statute carried serious prison time, and the evidence against them had been gathered over months of careful investigation. Some defendants immediately began exploring plea deals, creating tension within the club as loyalty to the organization clashed with the prospect of lengthy sentences. The legal strategy also sent a message to other outlaw motorcycle clubs across Florida and beyond. Traditional criminal charges had often resulted in relatively light sentences that club members viewed as simply part of doing business. The aggravated rioting approach demonstrated that Florida was willing to use every legal tool at its disposal to respond to organized criminal violence. What made this approach particularly effective was how it aligned with the evidence seized during the raids. The weapons, communications, and organizational materials recovered from various locations supported the prosecution's argument that this wasn't just a spontaneous fight, but part of an ongoing pattern of organized criminal activity. As cases moved through the court system, the legal strategy would ultimately determine not just the fate of individual defendants, but the future of outlaw motorcycle clubs in Florida. The success or failure of the aggravated rioting prosecutions would influence how other states approached similar criminal organizations in the future. The arsenal that shocked investigators.
Procedure and have one group examine it. So digital forensics, phones, iPads, whatever's in there on the warrant, and of course any...
When the evidence from Operation Mongolian Beef was finally catalogued and analyzed, even experienced investigators were surprised by what they had uncovered. The 53 firearms seized during the raids, 38 handguns and 15 long guns, represented far more than what any legitimate motorcycle club would need or possess. Many of these weapons showed signs of modification or had serial numbers that had been filed off to prevent tracing. Some were high-capacity firearms that suggested preparation for sustained conflict rather than personal protection. The sheer quantity indicated this wasn't casual gun ownership, but rather an organized effort to arm a criminal enterprise. The types of weapons recovered told a story about the Mongols' intentions. High-capacity pistols, assault-style rifles, and shotguns configured for close-quarters combat weren't the typical choices of motorcycle enthusiasts. These were weapons selected for their effectiveness in violent confrontations with rivals or law enforcement. Several weapons recovered during the raids were traced back to thefts in other states, indicating the Mongols had connections to interstate weapons trafficking networks. Some had been reported stolen from gun stores, private residences, and even law enforcement agencies. The presence of these weapons suggested the club wasn't just buying firearms through legal channels, but actively participating in the black market weapons trade. The ammunition seized alongside the weapons told an even more disturbing story. Some locations contained thousands of rounds, far beyond what recreational shooters or hunters would typically store. This level of stockpiling suggested either preparation for significant violence or involvement in ammunition trafficking as another revenue stream. Beyond the firearms, investigators discovered sophisticated surveillance and counter-surveillance equipment. Police scanners, signal jammers, and detection devices showed that the Mongols weren't just paranoid about law enforcement attention. They were actively working to avoid detection and monitor police activities in their areas. The surveillance equipment found at various locations was professional-grade material that required significant investment and technical knowledge to operate effectively. Night vision equipment, long-range listening devices, and encrypted communication systems indicated a level of sophistication that went far beyond simple criminal activity. The gang vests and patches recovered during the raids provided crucial insight into the organization's structure. Different patches indicated specific roles: enforcers, treasurers, sergeants-at-arms, creating a clear picture of a hierarchical criminal organization rather than a casual riding club. Some patches indicated territory controlled, crimes committed, or ranks achieved within the club's structure. Analysis of the patches revealed a complex system of recognition and authority within the club. Patches indicating specific violent acts, territory conquered from rival clubs, and alliances with other criminal organizations painted a picture of an organization that rewarded criminal behavior and territorial expansion. Digital devices seized during the operation contained what prosecutors would later describe as a treasure trove of evidence. Cell phones, computers, and tablets held communications about club business, territory disputes, and plans for dealing with rival clubs. Some devices contained photos and videos directly connecting specific individuals to criminal activities. The digital evidence provided investigators with unprecedented insight into the club's operations. Encrypted messaging apps revealed communications about drug deals, weapons sales, and planned violence. Social media posts showed members flaunting their criminal lifestyle and threatening rivals. Even seemingly innocent photos often contained valuable intelligence about meetings, gatherings, and organizational structure. Financial evidence painted another concerning picture. Large amounts of cash found alongside weapons and gang paraphernalia raised serious questions about the source of these funds. Financial records and ledgers showed money flowing through the organization in patterns that couldn't be explained by legitimate employment or business activities. The financial investigation revealed multiple revenue streams for the organization. Evidence suggested involvement in drug trafficking, weapons sales, protection rackets, and illegal gambling operations. Money was laundered through various businesses and bank accounts, demonstrating a level of financial sophistication that required specialized knowledge and experience. Documents recovered from various locations revealed the extent of the Mongols' organization in Florida. Meeting minutes, membership lists, and communication records showed a structured criminal enterprise that operated with rules, hierarchy, and clear lines of authority. This wasn't a loose association of troublemakers, but a disciplined criminal organization. The documentation showed a club that took its criminal activities seriously. Written rules governed everything from how members should interact with law enforcement to procedures for disciplining those who violated club policies. Strategic planning documents outlined territorial expansion goals and methods for dealing with rival organizations. The evidence collection process itself was meticulous. Every item was photographed in place, properly documented, and carefully stored to maintain chain of custody. Investigators knew that the ultimate success of their cases would depend on presenting this evidence in court, so maintaining its integrity was paramount. Some of the most damaging evidence came from the residence of chapter president Carlos Cardona Batista. Materials found at his home suggested direct involvement in planning the Bike Week confrontation and other criminal activities. For prosecutors, this evidence would be crucial in establishing his leadership role in the organization. As the evidence was processed and analyzed, it became clear that Operation Mongolian Beef had uncovered more than just the aftermath of a gas station shooting. They had documented an entire criminal enterprise with sophisticated operations, significant resources, and a clear willingness to use violence to achieve their goals. Criminal records that told the real story. As investigators dug deeper into the backgrounds of the 28 arrested Mongols members, a disturbing pattern emerged. These weren't just motorcycle enthusiasts who had made one bad decision at a gas station. Many had extensive criminal histories that showed years or even decades of escalating illegal activity. The records revealed convictions for assault, weapons charges, drug distribution, theft, and in some cases, much more serious crimes. What was particularly concerning wasn't just that they had criminal backgrounds, but how those records showed progression from smaller crimes to more serious ones as they gained status within the club. Several members arrested in Volusia County had previous convictions for aggravated assault from a bar fight in Daytona Beach 2 years earlier. They had served short sentences, been released, and immediately returned to club activities. This pattern of brief incarceration, followed by return to criminal behavior, was repeated throughout the group. One member's record showed a particularly troubling progression. Starting with minor theft charges in his teens, he had gradually moved to assault, weapons violations, and eventually attempted murder charges that were plea bargained down to aggravated assault. His criminal career had evolved alongside his rise through the club's hierarchy, suggesting the organization rewarded and encouraged escalating criminal behavior. Some members had histories that extended well beyond simple assault. One had previous convictions for gun running across state lines, bringing those criminal connections and skills with him when he joined the Mongols. Others had been involved in drug trafficking operations that predated their club membership but continued afterward. The drug trafficking connections were particularly extensive among arrested members. Several had previous convictions for distribution of cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine. Others had been arrested but not convicted on drug charges, often due to witness intimidation or procedural issues. The pattern suggested the club actively recruited individuals with established drug trade connections. What made these criminal histories particularly valuable to prosecutors was how they revealed the club's recruitment patterns. The Mongols weren't just accepting anyone with a motorcycle and bad attitude. They were actively seeking people with specific criminal skills and a demonstrated willingness to use violence when ordered. Financial crime expertise was another common thread among members' backgrounds. Several had convictions for money laundering, tax evasion, and fraud. These skills were valuable to the club's operations, helping them move money through legitimate businesses and financial institutions while concealing the criminal sources of their income. At least 5 of the arrested members were actually on probation for previous offenses when the Bike Week shooting occurred. They had violated the terms of their release by associating with known felons and carrying weapons, demonstrating complete disregard for court orders and legal supervision. The violations of probation weren't just technical infractions. These members had been specifically ordered to avoid contact with other criminals and to surrender any firearms as conditions of their release. Their participation in armed club activities showed deliberate defiance of the legal system and commitment to the organization above personal consequences. Even more concerning were the 3 members who were in the country illegally. These individuals had obtained fake identification, joined an outlaw motorcycle club, and participated in criminal activities while completely avoiding immigration authorities. Their presence suggested international connections that worried federal agencies monitoring the case. The illegal immigrants among the arrested members represented a particularly complex challenge for law enforcement. Their criminal activities in the United States were compounded by immigration violations, but their deportation would remove potential witnesses and defendants from the legal process. Federal agencies had to balance immigration enforcement with criminal prosecutions. The criminal backgrounds weren't limited to violent crimes. Several members had histories of financial crimes, including money laundering, fraud, and tax evasion. These skills were valuable to the club's operations, helping them move money and maintain the appearance of legitimate income while engaging in illegal activities. When prosecutors presented bail arguments, they relied heavily on these criminal histories to argue for high bail or denial of bail entirely. The pattern of escalating criminal behavior, combined with ongoing gang membership, painted a picture of individuals who posed continued threats to public safety. For law enforcement officers who had been tracking some of these individuals for years, the arrests were particularly satisfying. They finally had the opportunity to use intelligence that had been gathered over multiple incidents to build comprehensive cases against people they knew were involved in ongoing criminal activity. The extensive criminal backgrounds of the arrested members also helped investigators map the club's organizational structure. Those with histories of violence typically served as enforcers. Those with financial crime backgrounds handled money laundering and other economic activities. Those who had managed to avoid serious convictions despite multiple incidents were often in leadership positions. Defense attorneys struggled with how to address their clients' criminal histories. While they argued that past convictions shouldn't prejudice current cases, prosecutors maintained that the patterns were directly relevant to understanding the organized criminal nature of the Mongols' activities. As cases moved toward potential trials, some members with the most serious criminal histories began exploring plea agreements. They understood that their records would make them unsympathetic to juries and could result in maximum sentences if convicted. This created tensions within the club as members faced pressure to maintain loyalty while confronting the reality of lengthy prison terms. The 3 who got away, While Operation Mongolian Beef succeeded in arresting 28 Mongols members in a single coordinated sweep, the job wasn't completely finished. When investigators tallied their results, they found themselves with 3 suspects still at large, individuals who were considered among the most dangerous because of their direct involvement in the gas station violence. Law enforcement made a strategic decision not to publicly release the names of these fugitives, hoping to prevent them from receiving assistance from sympathizers while still distributing their information to agencies and sources who might help locate them. What officials did make clear was that these 3 were considered armed and extremely dangerous. The decision to keep their identities partially confidential reflected the serious nature of their involvement in the original violence. Intelligence suggested that these 3 weren't just present during the gas station shooting. They may have been among those who actually fired weapons. Their capture was considered crucial not just for completing the arrest record, but for public safety. The search for these fugitives intensified in the days following the raids. Digital wanted posters were distributed to law enforcement agencies across the Southeast. The U.S. Marshals Service, specialists in fugitive apprehension, took the lead on tracking these individuals with teams experienced in motorcycle gang cases. What made finding these 3 particularly challenging was the nature of outlaw motorcycle clubs themselves. These organizations maintain extensive networks across multiple states, with members who follow strict codes of loyalty. Someone on the run could potentially find safe houses, cash, transportation, and new identities through these connections. The Mongols' national network presented law enforcement with a significant challenge. The club had chapters in dozens of states, along with international connections that could potentially provide refuge for fugitives. Each of these locations required monitoring and investigation, consuming significant resources from multiple agencies. Sheriff Mike Chitwood made public appeals for information, emphasizing that these 3 needed to face justice like their associates. A special tip line was established specifically for information about the fugitives, with promises of anonymity for anyone providing helpful leads. As days turned into weeks, investigators received tips from across Florida and beyond. Some reported sightings at gas stations or motels. Others claimed the suspects had fled to Mexico or were hiding in remote areas. Each lead required investigation and follow-up, consuming significant resources but considered necessary given the violent nature of the original crime. The ongoing search revealed the challenges of pursuing fugitives in the modern era. While technology provided law enforcement with sophisticated tracking tools, it also gave suspects new ways to avoid detection. Prepaid cell phones, cryptocurrency transactions, and encrypted communications made it easier for fugitives to coordinate their escape and evasion efforts. The continued freedom of these 3 suspects kept the case in public attention longer than it might otherwise have remained. Local news provided regular updates on the search, featuring interviews with law enforcement officials who emphasized that Operation Mongolian Beef wouldn't be complete until all suspects were in custody. For communities affected by the Mongols' presence, knowing that 3 potentially dangerous members remained at large created ongoing unease. Some residents worried that these individuals might attempt to regroup or retaliate against those they believed had cooperated with law enforcement. The psychological impact on the community was significant. Parents who had witnessed the original gas station violence found themselves looking over their shoulders, wondering if they might encounter one of the fugitives at another public location. Business owners who had previously dealt with club members worried about potential retaliation for cooperating with the investigation. The ongoing search also complicated legal cases against those who had been arrested. Defense attorneys argued that without all participants in custody, it was impossible to fairly determine individual roles in the gas station confrontation. Prosecutors countered that evidence against each arrested member stood independently. As time passed, some officials began speculating that the 3 might have fled the country, possibly to Mexico or other locations where the Mongols had international connections. This possibility led to increased cooperation with foreign law enforcement and border authorities. The international aspect of the search required coordination with federal agencies that had jurisdiction over border security and international fugitive apprehension. The complexity of these operations often meant that progress was slow and required patience from local communities who wanted immediate resolution. For the general public, the three fugitives gradually became symbols of the resilience of outlaw motorcycle clubs in the face of law enforcement pressure. Stories and rumors circulated about narrow escapes and secret hideouts, some based in fact, others pure speculation. Despite these challenges, law enforcement remained committed to finding the three suspects. As one senior investigator noted, this wasn't a case they would let go cold, regardless of how long it took to locate and arrest the remaining individuals. The unprecedented cooperation that made it work. What truly set Operation Mongolian Beef apart from previous law enforcement actions against motorcycle clubs wasn't just the scale of arrests or evidence seized, but the extraordinary level of cooperation between agencies that typically operate with their own jurisdictions and priorities. This operation created a new model of inter-agency coordination that would become a template for future actions against organized criminal groups. The Volusia County Sheriff's Office anchored the operation, providing local knowledge, resources, and leadership under Sheriff Mike Chitwood's personal oversight. But local resources alone couldn't handle an operation of this magnitude, which is where federal partnerships became crucial. The FBI contributed through multiple field offices spanning from Jacksonville, Tampa, and Miami in Florida to Richmond, Newark, Columbia, and Charlotte beyond state lines. This network allowed investigators to track suspects across state boundaries and access intelligence that local departments couldn't reach. Federal resources brought capabilities that local departments simply couldn't match. Advanced surveillance equipment, digital forensics laboratories, and analytical software helped investigators process vast amounts of data collected during the 4-month investigation. The FBI's experience with similar organizations nationally provided crucial insights into the Mongols' structure and tactics. The U.S. Marshals Service handled tracking and apprehension of suspects, particularly those who had left Florida. Their expertise in fugitive apprehension proved invaluable when officers needed to locate and arrest members in other states. State agencies were equally important to the operation's success. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement provided investigative support and technical assistance. The Florida Highway Patrol helped monitor movement along key transportation routes, ensuring suspects couldn't simply ride out of the state when the operation launched. The coordination extended beyond just sharing resources. Daily briefings included representatives from each participating agency, ensuring everyone operated with the same current intelligence. Joint task force meetings allowed investigators to share insights and coordinate their activities in real time, preventing duplication of effort and maximizing effectiveness. What made this cooperation work wasn't just agencies working together, but seamless information sharing between them. Daily briefings, shared databases, and joint command centers allowed everyone to operate with the same current intelligence. Officers from different departments were paired together, combining federal resources with local knowledge. The legal coordination was equally unprecedented. State attorneys from multiple counties worked with federal prosecutors to determine the most effective charges for each suspect. This legal strategy team's decision to use Florida's aggravated rioting statute ensured consistency across all cases, regardless of where arrests occurred. Technical resources were shared freely between agencies. When local departments needed specialized surveillance equipment or digital forensics capabilities, federal partners provided them. When federal agents needed detailed local geography knowledge, county deputies offered guidance. The financial resources required for such an extensive operation were shared among all participating agencies. Federal grants supported overtime costs for local officers. State agencies provided specialized equipment and vehicles. Local departments contributed their knowledge of community dynamics and established informant networks. This shared commitment ensured no single agency bore the entire burden. The planning phase demonstrated this cooperative spirit. For weeks before the July 2nd raids, representatives from each agency met regularly to coordinate every aspect of the operation. They rehearsed scenarios, developed contingency plans, and ensured every officer understood both their individual role and how it fit the larger mission. Communication systems were integrated so that teams across multiple states could coordinate their movements precisely. Real-time updates allowed commanders to adjust resources as needed, sending additional support where resistance was encountered or redirecting teams when targets weren't found at expected locations. On the day of the raids, this cooperation reached its pinnacle. Integrated communication systems allowed teams across the state to coordinate movements precisely. As arrests were made in different locations, real-time updates allowed commanders to adjust resources as needed. After the operation, this spirit of cooperation continued into evidence processing and case building. Laboratories shared workloads, analysts from different agencies worked together, and prosecutors from multiple jurisdictions coordinated their approaches to ensure consistent outcomes. The success of Operation Mongolian Beef has since become a case study in effective multi-agency cooperation. Law enforcement leaders from across Florida and beyond have studied its structure and protocols as a model for future operations against organized criminal groups. The clubhouse raid that ended an era.
We watched as investigators went to club members' homes in Edgewater. We watched one walk out, surrender peacefully.
The raid on the Mongols' Edgewater clubhouse represented more than just another search warrant execution. It was the symbolic destruction of the club's power center in Florida, the place where decisions were made, plans were hatched, and the organization's presence in the community was most visible. SWAT teams approached the clubhouse before sunrise, knowing this wasn't just a building, but the heart of an organization they were working to dismantle. The structure itself had served as headquarters, meeting place, and symbol of the Mongols' territorial control in the area. The clubhouse had been under surveillance for months before the raid. Investigators had documented who came and went, when meetings were held, and what activities took place there. Hidden cameras and listening devices had captured conversations that would later prove crucial in building cases against individual members. Inside the clubhouse, officers discovered evidence that confirmed their suspicions about the building's importance to the organization. Meeting areas, communication equipment, and organizational materials painted a picture of a location that served as mission control for criminal activities throughout the region. The layout of the clubhouse told its own story about the organization's priorities. Secured areas for storing weapons and valuable items, meeting rooms designed for confidential discussions, and living quarters for members who needed to avoid law enforcement attention, all demonstrated the building's central role in club operations. Evidence recovered from the clubhouse included financial records that detailed the club's criminal income streams, weapons storage areas that had held some of the firearms recovered during individual raids, and communications equipment that had been used to coordinate activities across multiple states. The seizure of the clubhouse struck at something deeper than just operational capability. For outlaw motorcycle clubs, their clubhouse represents identity, tradition, and presence in the community. By taking it away, law enforcement didn't just eliminate a meeting space, they erased the physical symbol of the club's existence in Florida. Beyond the immediate search, authorities began civil forfeiture proceedings to permanently seize the property, arguing it had been used for planning and coordinating criminal activity. This legal action ensured that even if individual members were eventually released, they wouldn't be returning to their former headquarters. The clubhouse had also served as a social center for members and their families, hosting parties, celebrations, and other events that reinforced loyalty to the organization. The loss of this gathering place disrupted social bonds that held the criminal enterprise together, making it much more difficult for remaining members to maintain their sense of identity and purpose. For the community surrounding the clubhouse, the raid represented the end of an intimidating presence that had affected local businesses and residents. Many had been afraid to report suspicious activities or cooperate with law enforcement due to fear of retaliation from club members. Local business owners who had been forced to tolerate the club's presence finally felt safe enough to speak publicly about their experiences. Stories emerged of intimidation, forced protection payments, and other criminal activities that had emanated from the clubhouse but had never been reported due to fear of retaliation. The tactical precision of the clubhouse operation demonstrated the professionalism and preparation that had gone into every aspect of Operation Mongolian Beef. Officers knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it, the result of months of intelligence gathering and planning. As news of the clubhouse seizure spread through the outlaw motorcycle community, it sent a clear message about law enforcement's commitment to dismantling criminal organizations completely, not just arresting individual members, but eliminating their infrastructure and presence. The success of Operation Mongolian Beef, from the initial gas station investigation through the clubhouse raid and mass arrests, proved that when law enforcement agencies work together with proper intelligence and legal strategy, even well-established criminal organizations can be effectively dismantled, leaving communities safer and sending a powerful message to other groups considering similar activities. The aftermath and what it means.
I'm Molly Reed, your Volusia County community correspondent. The Volusia Sheriff's Office and FBI have now arrested dozens of people tied to a motorcycle gang here.
The completion of Operation Mongolian Beef marked the end of the Mongols' organized presence in Florida, but it also represented something larger, a new approach to dealing with criminal organizations that had previously seemed untouchable. The operation's success sent shockwaves through the outlaw motorcycle community nationwide and provided a blueprint for similar actions in other states. In the months following the raids, other states began studying Florida's approach to see how it might be adapted to their own situations. The combination of extensive intelligence gathering, unprecedented interagency cooperation, and innovative legal strategies created a template that could be applied to various forms of organized crime. For the communities affected by the Mongols' presence, the operation provided a sense of relief that many residents hadn't felt in years. Gas station attendants no longer worried about serving customers wearing club colors. Restaurant owners no longer felt obligated to provide free meals or special treatment to avoid intimidation. Families could enjoy public events without fear of witnessing violence. The legal proceedings that followed the arrests would take years to fully resolve, but the immediate impact was clear. The Mongols' criminal enterprise in Florida had been effectively dismantled. Without their leadership structure, financial resources, weapons cache, and physical headquarters, the organization could not continue operating as it had. The success of Operation Mongolian Beef demonstrated that with proper planning, coordination, and legal strategy, law enforcement could effectively respond to organized criminal groups that had previously operated with impunity. The message was clear: public violence would not be tolerated, and those who brought it to community spaces would face comprehensive consequences that went far beyond individual arrests. Operation Mongolian Beef stands as proof that when law enforcement agencies work together with intelligence, determination, and proper legal tools, even the most established criminal organizations can be brought down. The operation didn't just arrest criminals, it dismantled an entire criminal enterprise, protected communities, and established a new standard for responding to organized crime in the modern era. Ever wondered what happens when tough bikers face their worst nightmare? Brett Kaios Pechi built his reputation as a feared enforcer, photographed with firearms, striking terror into Australian rivals. Then came December 7th, 2023. CCTV cameras captured the shocking moment. This is what happens when bikers go terribly wrong. But before we reveal the devastating moment that changed everything, you need to understand just how far this man had to fall. Because what makes this story so shocking isn't just what happened. It's who it happened to and how completely it contradicted everything he had spent years making people believe about him. The making of a monster, Brett Kaios Pechi wasn't just any ordinary motorcycle club member. By the time December 2023 rolled around, he had built a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. This was a man who had earned his stripes across multiple notorious clubs. First the Bandidos, then Brothers for Life, and finally landing with Rock Machine MC, where he served as a feared enforcer. To understand the magnitude of what was about to happen to Pechi, you have to appreciate what being an enforcer means in the bikie world. These aren't just tough guys who look intimidating at club meetings. Enforcers are the ones called upon when clubs need to send messages, collect debts, or handle situations that require a particular brand of persuasion that can't be found in any legitimate business handbook. Pechi had cultivated this image meticulously over the years. He was often photographed brandishing firearms, each image carefully crafted to reinforce his dangerous reputation. These weren't casual snapshots, They were strategic displays of power designed to let everyone in the bikie community know exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. But here's what makes the bikie world so fascinating and terrifying. Reputation is everything, and it can vanish faster than you might imagine. As we'll discover, even the most carefully constructed personas can crumble when faced with the wrong circumstances. To give you a glimpse of where this story is heading and why you need to stay with us until the end, let me tell you about Dr. James Kaufman, a respected endocrinologist who managed to maintain deep connections with the Hells Angels while practicing medicine in New Jersey. His story, which we'll explore in detail later, shows just how dramatically these double lives can collapse. What began as a successful medical career ended with accusations of murder, racketeering, and drug dealing, ultimately culminating in Kaufman taking his own life in 2018 while leaving behind a 6-page suicide note claiming innocence. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, you need to understand that Brett Pesci's reputation wasn't built overnight, and it wasn't built on empty posturing. A history written in violence. The first major incident that put Pesci on law enforcement's radar occurred in 2013 at Broad Beach. This wasn't some minor scuffle or heated argument that got out of hand. The document describes it as a huge fight that happened in a busy place with Pesci right in the middle of it. What makes this incident particularly significant is what happened next. After the brawl, when Australian police began closing in on him, Pesci made a decision that would define his approach to handling legal pressure. He fled the country entirely, seeking refuge in Thailand. This wasn't a vacation or a temporary retreat. This was calculated flight from justice, placing himself beyond the immediate reach of Australian authorities who were building a case against him. Thailand has long been a destination of choice for Australians attempting to evade law enforcement, offering relative anonymity and distance from the Australian legal system. But as we'll see throughout this story, running from your problems in the bikie world often only delays the inevitable. The consequences have a way of catching up, sometimes in ways that are far worse than what you were originally trying to avoid. Speaking of inevitable consequences, let me give you another preview of where these stories typically end. Take Mad Randy Jorger, a Hells Angels member who managed to evade capture for an astonishing 17 years while operating as one of America's longest-standing fugitives. His story seemed like the ultimate success in avoiding justice, until his eventual capture in Mexico in 2014 resulted in a lifetime prison sentence. Those 17 years of freedom came at the cost of a lifetime behind bars. But let's return to Pesci's story. His time in Thailand eventually came to an end. Whether it was homesickness, financial pressures, or simply the unsustainable nature of life as a fugitive, Pesci made the fateful decision to return to Australia. The moment his feet touched Australian soil, police were waiting. He was arrested immediately upon his return, showing that law enforcement had been tracking his case and patiently waiting for the opportunity to apprehend him. This arrest marked a turning point in Pesci's life, but not the one you might expect. Rather than serving as a wake-up call that might have led him away from the bikie lifestyle, it seemed to only reinforce his commitment to projecting an image of toughness and invincibility. Building the ultimate tough guy image. After dealing with his legal troubles from the Broad Beach incident, Pesci threw himself into cultivating an even more intimidating persona. His association with Rock Machine MC gave him the perfect platform to build his reputation as someone you absolutely did not want to cross. The images from this period tell the story better than words ever could. Pesci wasn't shy about being photographed with firearms, and these weren't subtle displays of power. They were bold, unmistakable statements designed to communicate exactly what kind of man he had become. Every photo, every public appearance, every interaction was carefully calculated to reinforce the narrative that Brett Kaios Pesci was a dangerous man who commanded respect through fear. In the motorcycle club world, this kind of reputation serves multiple purposes. It provides protection from rivals who might otherwise see you as an easy target. It opens doors within the criminal underworld, where being perceived as dangerous can be more valuable than money in the bank. And perhaps most importantly, it builds the kind of street credibility that allows enforcers to do their jobs effectively. Sometimes the mere threat of what someone like Pesci might do is enough to resolve disputes without any actual violence occurring. But building this kind of reputation requires constant maintenance. In a world where everyone is trying to project strength and intimidation, you can't rest on past accomplishments. Every interaction becomes a test of your credibility. Every confrontation a potential challenge to your standing in the community. This is where our story takes a fascinating turn, because what happened to Pecci on that December day in 2023 wasn't the result of careful planning by his enemies or some elaborate setup designed to destroy him. Instead, it was a perfect storm of circumstances that exposed the gap between his carefully crafted image and the reality of what he would do when truly tested. Before we get to that moment, though, let me tell you about Mick Ho, former national president of the Comanchero Motorcycle Club, whose story illustrates just how quickly things can go wrong in this world. On February 15, 2018, after finishing a workout at Fitness First Gym in Rockdale, Sydney, Ho was approached by a gunman who fired multiple close-range shots to his head and body. The attack was savage and precise, leaving no opportunity for survival. What makes Ho's murder particularly chilling is that the prime suspect was Yusuf Nazlioglu, described as a former close friend and associate whose relationship with Ho had deteriorated after what seemed to be a minor incident during a fishing trip. This demonstrates how quickly alliances can turn deadly in the Biki world, with former brothers becoming potential assassins over seemingly minor grievances. Keep this story in mind as we return to Pecci, because it illustrates a crucial truth about the Biki world. No matter how carefully you build your reputation, no matter how feared you become, you're always just one moment away from everything falling apart. The calm before the storm. By December 2023, Brett Kaios Pecci had seemingly reached the peak of his influence within Rock Machine MC. His reputation as an enforcer was well established, his tough guy image was carefully maintained, and he moved through the bikie world with the confidence of someone who believed he was truly untouchable. Kingsway City Shopping Centre was just another stop on what should have been an ordinary day. Shopping centres are generally considered neutral territory in the bikie world. Public spaces where the unwritten rules of engagement are different from the streets or club territories where confrontations might be more expected. But neutrality is a fragile concept when you're dealing with rival motorcycle clubs, and the presence of both Rock Machine MC and Mongols MC members in the same location was always going to create tension. The Mongols MC, represented that day by Brad Baker and Clovis Chonga, were significant figures in their own right, not random club members looking for trouble. What happened next would be captured in excruciating detail by the shopping centre's CCTV system, creating a permanent record that would haunt Pecci for the rest of his life. But before we reveal those devastating moments, you need to understand what typically happens in these situations. When experienced Biki enforcers like Pecci find themselves confronted by rival club members, the expectation, both from their own clubs and the broader bikie community, is clear. You stand your ground, you show no fear, and you handle the situation in a way that maintains both your personal reputation and your club's standing. This is where the story of Otis Garrett becomes relevant. Once a Hells Angels Vallejo chapter president and millionaire dealer of crank or methamphetamine, Garrett's criminal activities escalated to unimaginable brutality, ultimately resulting in the murders of 24-year-old Margot Compton, 19-year-old Gary Sesler, and most horrifically, Compton's 6-year-old twin daughters, who were shot execution-style as they clutched their teddy bears tightly to their chests. Garrett's fate, 4 consecutive life sentences in prison, shows the extreme endpoint that can result when Biki conflicts escalate beyond all reasonable bounds. The reason I'm telling you Garrett's story now is to illustrate the kind of violence that's considered normal in this world, and why what Pecci did next was so shocking to everyone who witnessed it. The moment everything changed.
Change of profanities. The situation takes a rapid turn for the worse as Pecci unveils a hunting knife before retreating and bolting off into the shopping center in a flash. The subsequent events remain unclear, and it is unknown whether there was any further altercation or if the police were involved. Less than a month after the incident,
December 7th, 2023, Kingsway City Shopping Centre. the CCTV cameras were rolling, capturing what would become one of the most humiliating moments in modern Biki history. Brad Baker and Clovis Chonga, the two Mongols MC members, approached Brett Kaios Pechi in what appeared to be a coordinated move. This wasn't a chance encounter or accidental confrontation. This was clearly planned, with Baker approaching from one direction while Chonga positioned himself strategically from behind. For someone with Pechi's reputation and experience, this kind of approach should have triggered an immediate, almost instinctual response. Years of building his tough guy image, years of serving as an enforcer, years of photographed displays with firearms. All of this had led to this moment where his reputation would either be confirmed or destroyed. Initially, Pechi seemed to respond exactly as everyone would have expected. He pulled out a knife, signaling his readiness for confrontation. For a brief moment, it looked like this would play out exactly as these situations typically do in the Biki world. A dangerous confrontation between rival club members, potentially escalating to serious violence. But then came the moment that changed everything. Instead of standing his ground, instead of using the weapon he had drawn, instead of responding with the kind of violence that had built his reputation as a feared enforcer, Brett Kaios Pechi did something that stunned everyone who would later see the footage. He ran, not a tactical retreat, not a strategic withdrawal. This was a full-on sprint into the shopping center, leaving behind his tough guy image, his reputation, and his standing in the Biki world in one desperate dash for safety. The CCTV cameras captured every humiliating second of it. The moment when the feared enforcer, the man who had built his entire identity around being someone others should be afraid of, turned and fled from the confrontation he had initially seemed prepared to handle with violence. For someone whose entire sense of self-worth was built on being perceived as dangerous and fearless, this moment represented nothing less than the complete destruction of everything he had spent years building. But the immediate humiliation was just the beginning. What happened next would prove that in the age of social media and viral videos, a single moment of weakness can have consequences that extend far beyond the individuals involved. When reputation crumbles in real time. The CCTV footage of Pechi's flight didn't stay locked away in shopping center security files. In today's connected world, embarrassing moments like this have a way of finding their way onto the internet, where they take on a life of their own. When that footage hit social media, it spread like wildfire through the Biki community and beyond. This wasn't just local news or gossip shared among club members. This was viral content that reached thousands of people, each view adding another layer to Pechi's public humiliation. The devastating nature of this exposure can't be overstated. For someone who had carefully cultivated an image of fearless toughness, the footage showed exactly the opposite. Every frame of video contradicted years of reputation building. The man who had been photographed brandishing firearms was now permanently recorded running away at full speed from a confrontation. What made the humiliation even more intense was how clear and undeniable the evidence was. This wasn't a situation where different witnesses might provide conflicting accounts, allowing Pechi to maintain some version of events that preserved his dignity. The cameras captured the entire sequence in crystal clarity. The approach by the Mongols members, Pechi pulling out the knife, and then his sudden decision to flee. In the Biki world, where reputation is absolutely everything, this kind of public humiliation is considered worse than physical violence or even imprisonment. Physical injuries heal, prison sentences eventually end, but viral footage of perceived cowardice becomes permanent evidence that follows you forever. The psychological impact of this level of public humiliation is devastating for anyone, but it's particularly destructive for individuals whose entire identity is built around projecting strength and fearlessness. When that image is not just challenged but completely shattered in front of thousands of people, the resulting identity crisis can be overwhelming. But Pechi's personal humiliation was just the beginning of the story. What happened next would demonstrate just how quickly and completely the Biki world will turn on its own when reputation is damaged beyond repair. The Brotherhood's brutal response. The Biki world operates on a code of loyalty that's supposed to be unbreakable. Brothers for life isn't just a motto. It's meant to be a sacred bond that transcends individual failures and stands the test of time. The clubs promote an image of unwavering support for members, regardless of circumstances. But as Brett Kaios Pecci was about to discover, that loyalty has limits, and when those limits are crossed, the response can be swift and merciless. On January 3, 2024, less than a month after the Kingsway Shopping Center incident, Rock Machine MC made a public announcement on Facebook that sent shockwaves through the entire Beaky community. This wasn't a quiet internal disciplinary action or a private conversation about Pecci's future with the club. This was a formal, public rejection designed to make it absolutely clear that the club would not tolerate behavior that damaged their reputation. The announcement declared that Pecci was no longer a member of Rock Machine MC and was in bad standing with the organization. In the bikie world, being labeled as in bad standing represents one of the worst punishments possible. It's not just about losing your membership. It's about being officially marked as someone who has violated fundamental codes and is essentially persona non grata throughout the entire bikie community. But the club's response went even further than just expelling Pecci. In the same announcement, Rock Machine MC made another shocking declaration. Their Perth and South Australia chapters were no longer part of their organization. This represented an enormous organizational shakeup that affected dozens of members who may have had nothing to do with Pecci's actions. The timing of these announcements makes the connection clear. The Perth chapter that Pecci was associated with was suddenly disavowed right after his humiliating incident went viral. The club was willing to dramatically reduce their presence in Australia rather than risk having their reputation further tarnished by association with Pecci and the chapters connected to him. This kind of organizational amputation demonstrates just how seriously motorcycle clubs take their public image and how expendable individual members become when they threaten the club's standing. For Rock Machine MC, maintaining their reputation was more important than preserving relationships with dozens of loyal members who happened to be in the wrong chapters at the wrong time. The speed and public nature of this response reveals something crucial about Bikie loyalty. It's conditional on maintaining the club's interests and image. When those interests are threatened, the brotherhood that's supposed to be unbreakable can fracture instantly and completely. For Pecci, this public expulsion represented more than just losing his patch and membership. In the Bikie world, your club is your family, your protection, and your entire social structure. Without it, he was left completely isolated in a world full of potential enemies, including those he may have made during his years as an enforcer. The ripple effects of organizational collapse. The consequences of Pecci's moment of weakness extended far beyond his personal disgrace. When Rock Machine MC announced that their Perth and South Australia chapters were no longer part of their organization, dozens of members who had nothing to do with the Kingsway Shopping Center incident suddenly found themselves cut off from their club. Imagine being a loyal Rock Machine MC member in Perth or South Australia, faithfully upholding club standards for years, contributing to the organization's activities and building your identity around being part of this brotherhood. Then imagine waking up one morning to discover that your chapter no longer exists because of another member's moment of weakness caught on CCTV. These innocent members didn't just lose their club affiliation, they lost their livelihoods, protection networks, and entire social structures overnight. Many bikers structure their entire economic lives around club connections, from employment at club-affiliated businesses to protection rackets that depend on club reputation. When chapters are suddenly disavowed, these income sources vanish instantly. The power vacuum created by this organizational collapse often leads to dangerous territory wars. When established chapters suddenly disappear from the landscape, rival clubs quickly move to claim their territory, customers, and criminal operations. This scramble for power frequently turns violent as multiple groups compete to fill the void left by the collapsed organization. What's particularly revealing about Rock Machine MC's response is how it exposes the contradiction at the heart of outlaw motorcycle club culture. While these clubs promote an image of unbreakable brotherhood and loyalty unto death, the reality is that organizational survival will always trump individual bonds. When reputation and business interests are threatened, clubs will sacrifice any member, chapter, or alliance without hesitation. The fallout often extends to international relationships between affiliated chapters. Rock Machine MC has chapters across multiple countries. and the sudden disavowal of Australian chapters likely strained relationships with international partners who may have had close ties to the expelled units. Perhaps most tragically, organizational fallout often leads to former members forming splinter groups with unpredictable and often violent agendas. Cast out but still identifying with the Biki lifestyle, these orphaned members frequently establish new clubs with less established rules and norms, creating volatile new entities in the criminal ecosystem. This pattern of organizational collapse and reformation creates an unstable environment where violence becomes more likely, not less. The expelled members often carry deep resentment toward their former clubs, while the remaining organization may view the splinter groups as threats that need to be eliminated. The dark pattern of criminal escalation. Brett Kaios Pecci's story represents just one example of a disturbing pattern that's common throughout the Biki world. The gradual escalation from relatively minor offenses to increasingly serious criminal behavior. Understanding this pattern helps explain how someone ends up in Pecci's position, and why the consequences of his viral moment were so devastating. The journey typically begins with joining a motorcycle club that provides a sense of brotherhood and identity. For many members, this initial attraction is about belonging and respect, rather than criminal activity. However, as we see with Pecci's progression through multiple clubs, first the Bandidos, then Brothers for Life, and finally Rock Machine MC, each transition often marks a step up in criminal involvement. New prospects aren't immediately exposed to serious criminal activities. Instead, they undergo a calculated grooming process where boundaries are gradually pushed through increasingly questionable tasks that test loyalty and willingness to break rules. This might begin with something relatively minor, like serving as a lookout or transporting legal but suspicious packages. As prospects earn patches and become full members, they're progressively exposed to the club's criminal operations. This incremental exposure serves two purposes. It prevents law enforcement infiltration by slowly testing trustworthiness, and it psychologically conditions members to normalize increasingly serious criminal behavior. The 2013 Broad Beach Brawl involving Pecci demonstrates how public violence often serves as a stepping stone to more serious crimes. What started as a confrontation between rival clubs escalated into a situation so serious that Pecci felt compelled to flee to Thailand to escape Australian authorities. This kind of international flight from justice shows how deep bikers can become entangled in criminal activities. What accelerates this escalation is the economic structure of many clubs, which operate as sophisticated criminal enterprises where advancement depends on generating revenue. Members who prove most effective at expanding illegal business operations rise through ranks faster, creating a perverse incentive system rewarding increasingly serious criminal activity. The competition for status within clubs further drives this escalation, with members attempting to outdo each other's criminal exploits to gain recognition. This creates a dangerous spiral where each generation of members must engage in more extreme behavior to earn the same level of respect that previous generations achieved with lesser crimes. By the time members reach the level of notorious figures like Brett Kaios Pecci, they've typically progressed through dozens of escalating criminal activities, each one normalizing the next step. What began as relatively minor offenses has transformed into serious criminal enterprises that threaten public safety and create the kind of volatile situations that played out at Kingsway Shopping Centre. The tragic irony is that this escalation often leads members to a point where they've sacrificed everything legitimate in their lives: family relationships, career opportunities, financial security, for a lifestyle that ultimately offers no real protection or loyalty when things go wrong. The deadly game of double lives, one of the most fascinating and dangerous aspects of the Biki world, is how many members maintain shocking double lives, perfectly concealing their criminal activities behind seemingly normal facades. These cases reveal just how deceptive appearances can be, and how dramatically these carefully maintained personas can collapse. Dr. James Kaufman provides perhaps the most striking example of this duality. By day, he was a respected endocrinologist, running a successful practice in New Jersey, trusted by patients and colleagues alike. His professional credentials and medical expertise provided the perfect cover for what was happening behind the scenes. Deep connections with the Hells Angels and involvement in serious criminal enterprises. What makes these double lives especially dangerous is how effectively they can be maintained. Who would suspect a respected endocrinologist of being involved with one of the most notorious motorcycle gangs in the world? This respectable facade allowed Kaufman to operate undetected for years, using his legitimate medical practice as cover for illegal activities. The exposure of these double lives often comes with dramatic consequences. In Kaufman's case, his wife April, herself a radio host and veterans' rights advocate, discovered his involvement in illegal drug operations. This discovery set in motion a chain of events that ultimately led to April's murder in 2012, with Kaufman himself becoming the prime suspect. Brett Kaios Peachy maintained a similar duality, though less extreme than Kaufman's. To the public, he projected the image of a tough but legitimate motorcycle enthusiast. However, this image concealed his role as an enforcer involved in standover tactics and various illegal activities. When his viral moment of weakness exposed the gap between his cultivated tough guy image and reality, both sides of his life collapsed simultaneously. These double lives aren't just about hiding criminal activity, they're often about creating an alternate identity that provides power, respect, or status that members can't achieve in their everyday lives. For some, the Beaky persona offers intimidation power and street respect that their conventional lives lack. The psychological toll of maintaining these contradictory identities can be enormous. Living a double life requires constant vigilance, careful compartmentalization of relationships, and the ongoing stress of potentially being exposed. Many who attempt to maintain these dualities turn to substance abuse to cope with the psychological pressure. When these double lives are exposed, the fallout is often catastrophic across all areas of the person's existence. Professional reputations are destroyed, family relationships are shattered, and legal consequences often follow. For Dr. Kaufman, the exposure led to charges of murder, racketeering, and drug dealing. Unable to face these consequences, he ultimately took his own life in 2018, leaving behind a 6-page suicide note claiming innocence. The exposure of these double lives doesn't just impact the individuals involved, it creates shockwaves through families, workplaces, and communities that trusted these individuals. Patients who relied on Dr. Kaufman's medical expertise, April Kaufman, who married him believing in his respectable image, and professional colleagues who worked alongside him, all found their trust betrayed in the most fundamental way. When flight becomes the only option, when the walls start closing in on Beaky members facing serious legal consequences, many choose to flee rather than face the justice system. Brett Kaios Peachy's case provides a clear example of this pattern when he escaped to Thailand after the 2013 Broad Beach Brawl, demonstrating the lengths to which some club members will go to avoid legal accountability. Thailand has long been a destination for Australians attempting to evade justice, offering relative anonymity, cultural barriers that complicate law enforcement cooperation, and distance from Australian authorities. For Peachy, this wasn't a vacation or temporary retreat. It was a calculated attempt to place himself beyond the reach of the Australian legal system that was building a case against him. However, as Peachy's eventual fate demonstrates, flight from justice is often temporary rather than permanent. Despite his attempts to remain hidden in Thailand, he eventually returned to Australia, where police were waiting for him. He was arrested immediately upon his return, showing that law enforcement had been tracking his case and patiently waiting for the opportunity to apprehend him. The document reveals other examples of bikers who attempted similar evasion tactics with varying degrees of temporary success. Mad Randy Jorger, who rose to become Midwest president of the Hells Angels, managed to evade capture for an astonishing 17 years, while operating as one of America's longest-standing fugitives. His ability to remain hidden for nearly 2 decades made him a legend in criminal circles. But even Jorger's remarkable run eventually came to an end. His capture in Mexico in 2014 resulted in a lifetime prison sentence, proving that even the most elaborate attempts to flee justice often end in apprehension. Those 17 years of freedom came at the ultimate cost, the rest of his life behind bars. The The psychological toll of life on the run is another aspect rarely discussed, but critically important to understanding why flight often fails as a long-term strategy. Constant vigilance about potential capture, inability to maintain normal relationships, the stress of using false identities, and isolation from family and friends create their own form of psychological imprisonment. Some fugitives, like Peche, eventually choose to return home voluntarily, perhaps finding that the restrictions and paranoia of fugitive life constitute their own form of punishment. Others are captured through improved international law enforcement cooperation, advanced tracking technologies, and border control systems that make it increasingly difficult to remain hidden indefinitely. When bikers choose flight over facing justice, they often compound their legal problems significantly. Additional charges related to fleeing justice, crossing borders illegally, and any crimes committed while on the run add to their original offenses. This pattern of escalating legal troubles creates a situation where the consequences of eventually facing justice become far worse than what they were originally trying to avoid. The decision to flee also represents a fundamental admission that the tough guy persona these bikers cultivate is largely facade. Someone truly confident in their ability to handle confrontation and consequences wouldn't need to run from legal challenges. In choosing flight, they reveal the same kind of underlying fear that Peche displayed when he ran from the Mongols at Kingsway Shopping Centre. The betrayal that cuts deepest. Perhaps nothing illustrates the hollow nature of Biki brotherhood more starkly than how quickly these supposedly unbreakable bonds fracture under pressure. The document reveals numerous examples of former allies turning against each other with deadly consequences, exposing the conditional nature of loyalty in this world. Mick Ho's story provides one of the most chilling examples of how dramatically relationships can deteriorate. As former national president of the Comanchero Motorcycle Club, Ho had reached the pinnacle of Biki leadership. Yet his assassination on February 15, 2018, came not from rival club enemies, but from within his own circle of associates. The prime suspect in Ho's murder was Yusuf Nazlioglu, described as a former close friend and associate whose relationship with Ho had deteriorated after what appeared to be a minor incident during a fishing trip. This demonstrates how quickly deep personal bonds can transform into mortal enmity over seemingly trivial grievances in the Biki world. What makes Ho's murder particularly disturbing is the calculated nature of the assassination. The gunman knew exactly where to find Ho, at Fitness First Gym in Rockdale, Sydney, following his regular workout routine. The attack was savage and precise, leaving no opportunity for survival, suggesting that the killer possessed intimate knowledge of Ho's habits and vulnerabilities. This pattern of intimate knowledge being weaponized appears repeatedly in Biki conflicts. Former friends and associates know each other's routines, security measures, family connections, and psychological weak points. When relationships turn hostile, this insider knowledge becomes extraordinarily dangerous, creating the potential for attacks that would be impossible for outsiders to orchestrate. The document references another example of internal betrayal with Raymond Ray Folks, a Hells Angels chapter president who was suspected of sexual assault involving a fellow club member's wife. This represents perhaps the ultimate violation of brotherhood codes, demonstrating how personal desires and impulses can override the supposed loyalty bonds that hold these organizations together. Brett Kaios Peachy experienced his own form of betrayal when Rock Machine MC not only expelled him, but did so through a public Facebook announcement designed to humiliate him as completely as possible. The club that had once embraced him as an enforcer and valued member turned against him with shocking speed once his reputation became a liability. What's particularly revealing about these betrayals is how they often occur during moments of vulnerability. Peachy was betrayed after his humiliating flight from confrontation exposed him as weak. Ho was betrayed when his guard was down during a routine workout. These opportunistic betrayals suggest that Biki brothers are constantly evaluating each other for signs of weakness that might present opportunities for advancement or revenge. The frequency of these betrayals reveals a fundamental truth about Biki culture. Beneath the mythology of unbreakable brotherhood lies a cold calculation focused on self-preservation and personal advancement. When maintaining loyalty becomes costly or inconvenient, these supposed brothers will abandon each other without hesitation. The public pays the price. When bikers go wrong, innocent bystanders often find themselves caught in dangerous crossfire that they never chose to be part of. The confrontation at Kingsway City Shopping Centre involving Brett Kaios Pecci clearly demonstrates how quickly Bikie conflicts can transform ordinary public spaces into potentially deadly zones. The shopping centre incident began with what appeared to be a coordinated approach by two Mongols MC members toward Pecci in a busy retail environment where families and shoppers were going about their normal daily activities. When Pecci responded by pulling out a knife, he introduced a deadly weapon into a space filled with innocent people who had no connection to Bikie conflicts. Even though Pecci ultimately chose to flee rather than fight, the mere presence of armed Bikie members in confrontation mode represented a serious threat to public safety. Shopping centers, with their crowds, limited escape routes, and mix of adults and children, represent particularly dangerous environments for these kinds of confrontations to occur. The 2009 Sydney Airport clash between the Comanchero and Hells Angels provides an even more shocking example of how Bikie violence can terrorize innocent bystanders. What began as tension between rival club leaders escalated into a full-scale public brawl that horrified travelers and airport staff. Gang members repurposed metal bollards meant for crowd control as weapons, turning an airport terminal into a battlefield. The violence at Sydney Airport was so extreme and public that it led to the death of Anthony Zervas, brother of a Hells Angels member who was brutally beaten during the melee. Innocent travelers found themselves trapped in the middle of what was essentially a gang war, playing out in real time in a major transportation hub, creating trauma that likely affected hundreds of witnesses. These public clashes demonstrate how the Bikie world's conflicts don't stay contained within club territories or private disputes. The unpredictable nature of these confrontations means that any public encounter between rival club members could potentially erupt into violence without warning, putting everyone in the vicinity at risk. The level of weaponry often involved makes these public safety threats particularly concerning. From Pecci's knife at the shopping centre to the firearms many Bikie members are known to carry, these conflicts involve potentially deadly weapons in spaces where families shop, children play, and ordinary citizens go about their daily lives. The drug trafficking operations mentioned throughout the document contribute another layer of public harm. These criminal enterprises don't just generate profits for club members, they create addiction, destroy families, and generate the peripheral crime that surrounds drug markets in communities across the country. Law enforcement agencies recognize these threats to public safety as a top priority. The national crackdown on Bikie groups that followed the Sydney Airport brawl demonstrates how seriously authorities take the risk these conflicts pose to innocent citizens. When shopping centers become scenes of armed confrontations and airports transform into battlegrounds, it represents a fundamental failure of the social contract. Public spaces should be safe for everyone, but Bikie conflicts consistently violate that basic expectation, creating fear and danger that extends far beyond the criminal participants. The final destination, prison or death. The document reveals a sobering pattern about life in outlaw motorcycle clubs. For most members who rise to prominence, the story ends in one of two ways: lengthy prison sentences or violent death. The tragic endpoints described throughout illustrate the ultimate cost of the bikie lifestyle. Otis Garrett's case represents perhaps the most extreme example of how far criminal escalation can go. Once a Hells Angels Vallejo chapter president and millionaire dealer of crank or methamphetamine, his journey ended with unimaginable brutality. The murders of 24-year-old Margot Compton, 19-year-old Gary Sessler, and most horrifically, Compton's 6-year-old twin daughters who were shot execution-style as they clutched their teddy bears tightly to their chests. Garrett's fate reflects the extreme endpoint of the Bikie lifestyle. 4 consecutive life sentences in prison, ensuring he will die behind bars for his crimes. His transformation from club president to convicted mass murderer shows the dark trajectory that can unfold when violence becomes normalized within Bikie culture. Raymond Ray Folks provides another example of how leadership positions often lead to devastating endpoints. As president of the Hells Angels Sonoma County chapter, Folks encouraged violence and criminal behavior within the club and fostered an environment where brutality was not only tolerated but often celebrated. His leadership philosophy ultimately led to a substantial prison term in 2020 for charges related to drug distribution. For other prominent Bikie figures, the endpoint comes even more violently through assassination. Mick Ho's brutal murder outside the Rockdale gym demonstrates how former brothers can become executioners when relationships turn hostile. The savage and precise nature of his killing, with multiple close-range shots to his head and body, illustrates the level of violence that characterizes these internal conflicts. Dr. James Kaufman's story shows how the pressure of exposure can lead to the ultimate tragic endpoint: suicide. Unable to face charges of murder, racketeering, and drug dealing related to his secret connections with Hells Angels, Kaufman took his own life in 2018 while leaving behind a 6-page suicide note claiming innocence. His death represents the complete collapse of a carefully maintained double life. Even those who manage to evade immediate justice often face inevitable tragic endings. Randy Mad Randy. Yorga's 17 years as a fugitive might have seemed like a successful escape from consequences, but his eventual capture in Mexico led to a lifetime prison sentence, his years of freedom ultimately costing him the rest of his life behind bars. For Brett Kaios Pecci, while the document doesn't detail his ultimate fate beyond his club expulsion, the destruction of his reputation and loss of protection represents its own form of social death in the bikie world. Without club membership and with his tough guy image permanently destroyed, his future in this dangerous environment appears bleak. These tragic endpoints aren't anomalies or exceptions. They represent the natural conclusion of a lifestyle built on violence, criminality, and the pursuit of power through intimidation. The document provides case after case of bikie members whose stories end in prison cells, assassination, suicide, or social exile, revealing the true cost of what initially appears to be freedom and brotherhood. What makes these endings particularly tragic is how they often come after members have sacrificed everything legitimate in their lives for the club. Family relationships, career opportunities, financial security, and personal safety are all forfeited in pursuit of status within organizations that ultimately offer no protection when consequences arrive. The pattern is so consistent that it raises fundamental questions about the appeal of the bikie lifestyle. When the documented endpoints are so consistently tragic, what drives people to continue choosing this path? The answer may lie in the immediate gratification of respect and power that Bikie membership provides, combined with the psychological inability to accurately assess long-term risks. The viral moment that destroyed everything.
Brett Kaios Pecci's life dramatically. The center's CCTV cameras, typically recording mundane daily activities.
Now that you understand the full context of Brett Kaios Pecci's life, the world he operated in, and the typical endpoints that await those who travel this path, we can return to that devastating moment at Kingsway Shopping Center with complete appreciation for its significance. December the 7th, 2023 wasn't just another day for Pecci. It was the day when years of carefully constructed reputation building would crumble in seconds. Captured in crystal clear CCTV footage that would expose the gap between his cultivated image and reality. When Brad Baker and Clovis Chonga approached him in that coordinated move, they weren't just confronting another Bikie. They were testing someone whose entire identity was built on being too dangerous to challenge. The initial moments played out exactly as Pecci's reputation would suggest. He pulled out a knife, signaling his readiness for the kind of violent confrontation that had built his standing in the Bikie world. But then came the moment that changed everything. Instead of following through with the violence that his reputation promised, Pecci made a split-second decision that would haunt him forever. He turned and ran, abandoning his tough guy persona in a desperate sprint for safety. The CCTV cameras captured every humiliating detail of his flight, creating permanent evidence of the moment when his carefully maintained facade collapsed completely. The footage showed not the feared enforcer that everyone believed Pecci to be, but a man who would choose escape over confrontation when truly tested. When that footage hit social media, it didn't just go viral. It destroyed an entire mythology that Pecci had spent years building. Every view of the video reinforced the reality that his reputation for toughness was largely an act, that his brandished firearms and enforcer status were props in a performance rather than genuine indicators of character. The viral nature of the humiliation made it impossible for Pecci to control the narrative or minimize the damage. In the past, a moment of weakness might be witnessed by a few people, allowing for conflicting accounts that could preserve some dignity. But crystal clear CCTV footage shared instantly with thousands of people made denial impossible and humiliation permanent. Rock Machine MC's response was swift and merciless. A public Facebook announcement declaring Pecci expelled and in bad standing, followed by the disavowal of entire chapters associated with him. The club that had once valued him as an enforcer turned against him completely, prioritizing their organizational reputation over any loyalty to a member who had become a liability. The broader pattern revealed. Brett Kayos Pecci's story serves as a perfect illustration of broader patterns that plague the outlaw motorcycle club world. His journey from respected enforcer to humiliated outcast demonstrates how quickly fortunes can change when the facade of toughness is stripped away by reality. The criminal escalation pattern is clearly visible in Pecci's progression through multiple clubs and his involvement in increasingly serious incidents, from the 2013 Broad Beach Brawl to his role as an enforcer for Rock Machine MC. Each step up the criminal ladder brought more risk, more exposure, and ultimately more potential for the kind of devastating fall he experienced. His attempt to flee to Thailand after the Broad Beach incident illustrates the flight from justice pattern that's common throughout the bikie world. Like Randy, Mad Randy, Jorga, and others, Pecci discovered that running from consequences often only delays the inevitable while creating additional legal complications. The double life aspect is evident in Pecci's maintenance of both a public tough guy image and the reality of someone who would run when truly confronted. This gap between perception and reality ultimately proved unsustainable when exposed to public scrutiny. The betrayal pattern played out dramatically in Rock Machine MC's public expulsion of Pecci and disavowal of associated chapters. The supposed brotherhood proved to be entirely conditional on maintaining the club's reputation and interests. The public safety threat is clear in how Pecci's confrontation with the Mongols put innocent shoppers at risk when he pulled a knife in a busy shopping center. The viral footage serves as a reminder of how bikie conflicts consistently spill into public spaces, where innocent people become unwilling participants in dangerous situations. Most significantly, Pecci's story reveals the tragic endpoint pattern that awaits most prominent bikie figures. While his particular ending may be social death and exile rather than prison or assassination, the destruction of his reputation and loss of protection represents its own form of devastating conclusion to a life built around projecting power and inspiring fear. The ultimate question. As we conclude this examination of Brett Kayos, Pecci's spectacular fall from grace, and the broader patterns it reveals about the outlaw motorcycle club world, we're left with a fundamental question. Why do people continue to choose this lifestyle when the documented endpoints are so consistently tragic? The answer may lie in the immediate gratification that bikie membership provides, the instant respect, the sense of brotherhood, the power that comes from being feared. For many, these short-term benefits seem to outweigh the long-term risks, even when those risks include prison, assassination, or public humiliation. But as Pecci's story demonstrates, the respect and power that bikie membership offers is often built on foundations that can collapse in seconds. When tested by real confrontation, the tough guy persona may prove to be nothing more than carefully maintained theater. The viral footage of Pecci's flight from the Mongols has become a permanent reminder that in the age of social media and ubiquitous cameras, there's no hiding from moments of truth. Every interaction is potentially recorded. Every moment of weakness can become permanently preserved evidence that destroys years of reputation building. Perhaps most importantly, Pecci's story reveals that the loyalty and brotherhood promised by motorcycle clubs is ultimately conditional on maintaining the organization's interests. When members become liabilities, they're discarded as quickly and completely as any business would eliminate a problematic employee. The organizations that promise family, protection, and unconditional loyalty will abandon their members without hesitation when those members threaten the club's reputation or bottom line. The brotherhood that's supposed to last forever can end with a Facebook post, leaving former members isolated in a dangerous world where they've made numerous enemies through their previous activities. Brett Kaios Pecci thought he was untouchable, a feared enforcer with guns, tattoos, and a reputation that made others tremble. His shocking moment at Kingsway Shopping Centre proved that no amount of carefully crafted intimidation can substitute for genuine courage when the moment of truth arrives. His humiliating sprint to safety didn't just go viral, it destroyed his Bicky career overnight and reshaped entire chapters of Rock Machine MC. From enforcer to outcast in just one viral video, Pecci's story serves as the ultimate example of what happens when bikers go terribly wrong. The lesson is clear. In a world built on image and reputation, reality has a way of eventually asserting itself. And when it does, the fall can be swift, complete, and permanently devastating. The tough guy personas, the brandished weapons, the enforcer roles, all of it can vanish in the seconds it takes to turn and run from a confrontation. This is what happens when bikers go terribly wrong. Not just individual destruction, but the exposure of fundamental weaknesses in the entire mythology that sustains outlaw motorcycle club culture. The brotherhood proves hollow, the loyalty proves conditional, and the toughness proves to be largely performance art that crumbles under real pressure. Brett Kaios Pecci's story will likely serve as a cautionary tale within Bicky circles for years to come, a permanent reminder that in the age of viral videos and social media exposure, there's nowhere to hide when the carefully constructed facade finally falls apart. When the federal government decided to take down one of America's most feared motorcycle clubs, they never expected the real destruction would come from within. The Mongols Motorcycle Club survived decades of rivalry, violence, and law enforcement pressure, only to be nearly destroyed by a drunk phone call and a wife's revenge. What happened next shocked everyone involved and changed motorcycle club history forever. The foundation of power. How Lil Dave built his empire.
Lil Dave had to maintain order and resolve conflicts between members. It was a delicate balance of showing strength and keeping everyone united. He had to make tough decisions, sometimes putting the club's interests above personal friendships. Despite the challenges, Lil Dave thrived in his role. He was respected and feared, both within the club and in the larger motorcycle club's community.
The Mongols Motorcycle Club wasn't some weekend riding group that got out of hand. This organization emerged from the gritty streets of East Los Angeles in the late 1960s, when Hispanic bikers found themselves largely shut out of the predominantly white Hells Angels. What started as a response to exclusion eventually grew into one of the most feared and respected outlaw motorcycle clubs in the world. David Santillan, known to everyone as Lil Dave, didn't stumble into leadership by accident. When he took control of the Mongols, the club was facing an identity crisis. Years of internal conflicts, legal pressures, and a lack of clear direction had left many members questioning what it meant to wear the Mongols patch. The club had drifted away from its core identity, the brotherhood of the road, the thunder of Harley engines, and the unbreakable bonds forged through shared rides and mutual respect. But here's what nobody knew at the time. This rebuilding effort would eventually put Lil Dave in a position where a single conversation would destroy everything he worked to build. The very success he created would become the foundation for suspicions that would tear the club apart from within. Lil Dave recognized that the club needed to get back to basics. His first major initiative was bringing back the monthly motorcycle rides and runs that had been abandoned during the chaos of previous years. These weren't just casual weekend rides, they were organized events that brought members from different chapters together, reinforcing the idea that despite their various illegal activities, they were first and foremost motorcyclists. The rumble of dozens of bikes rolling down the highway in formation sent a clear message to both rival clubs and law enforcement. The Mongols were united, and they weren't going anywhere. The restructuring went far beyond organizing rides. Lil Dave understood that respect in the outlaw motorcycle world came through a combination of fear and admiration. He began establishing strict protocols for how members conducted themselves, both within the club and in public. Discipline became a cornerstone of his leadership style, but it wasn't the kind of harsh authoritarianism that crushes spirits. Instead, he created a system where loyalty was rewarded and disloyalty was punished swiftly and decisively. Under his guidance, the Mongols developed a sophisticated hierarchy that rivaled any corporate structure. Each chapter had clear leadership roles, and communication between different regions became streamlined and efficient. This organizational approach allowed the club to coordinate activities across multiple states, while maintaining the tight-knit feel that made motorcycle clubs appealing to members seeking brotherhood and belonging. The transformation wasn't just internal. Lil Dave understood that in the outlaw motorcycle world, perception was everything. He worked to cultivate an image of the Mongols as serious, professional, and not to be underestimated. This meant paying attention to details that other club leaders might overlook: how members dressed at public events, how they interacted with law enforcement during traffic stops, and how they conducted themselves in bars and other establishments where rival clubs might be present. This careful attention to image management helped the Mongols gain respect from other outlaw motorcycle clubs. In a world where reputation could mean the difference between peaceful coexistence and violent conflict, Lil Dave's approach was both practical and effective. The club began to be seen as a major player in the outlaw motorcycle scene, capable of holding its own against established organizations like the Hells Angels and the Outlaws. The success of these efforts became evident in how other clubs began to treat the Mongols. What had once been dismissive attitudes toward the relatively younger organization shifted to cautious respect. Invitations to major motorcycle events and rallies began arriving more frequently. Other club leaders started reaching out to establish territorial agreements and mutual respect pacts. For Lil Dave, these developments represented validation that his approach was working. Yet success in the outlaw motorcycle world comes with its own set of challenges. As the Mongols grew in power and influence, they also attracted more attention from law enforcement agencies. The FBI, ATF, and local police departments began dedicating more resources to monitoring club activities. This increased scrutiny would eventually become a constant presence in the lives of Mongols members, influencing everything from where they met to how they communicated with each other. This growing law enforcement attention would eventually lead to a relationship that nobody could have predicted, one between Lil Dave and a federal agent that would ultimately provide his enemies with the weapon they needed to destroy him. Navigating the dangerous waters of outlaw culture, leading an outlaw motorcycle club requires a unique set of skills that most people never have to develop. Lil Dave found himself constantly balancing competing demands and pressures that would have crushed a less determined leader. On one side were his own members, each with their own personalities, ambitions, and problems. Some were weekend warriors who joined for the camaraderie and image, while others were hardcore criminals who saw the club as cover for their illegal activities. Managing these different types of members required diplomatic skills that would have been valuable in any organization. Lil Dave had to keep the weekend riders engaged and feeling valued while ensuring that the more criminally inclined members didn't bring unnecessary heat down on the entire organization. This balancing act played out in countless small decisions: which events to attend, which territories to claim, how to respond to provocations from rival clubs, and when to push back against law enforcement pressure. The threat from rival clubs was constant and multifaceted. The Hells Angels, with their decades of experience and international reach, viewed the growing influence of the Mongols with suspicion and occasional hostility. Territorial disputes could escalate from heated words to violence with little warning. Bar fights, highway confrontations, and even attacks on clubhouses were all part of the reality that Lil Dave had to navigate. These conflicts weren't just about pride or machismo, though those elements were certainly present. Control of territory often meant control of lucrative illegal activities, drug distribution networks, protection rackets, and illegal gambling operations. When the Mongols expanded into new areas, they weren't just claiming symbolic territory, they were potentially disrupting established criminal enterprises that other organizations had spent years developing. The complexity of these relationships meant that Lil Dave had to become something of a diplomat in addition to being a club leader. Negotiations with other clubs required careful attention to protocol and respect. A wrong word or perceived insult could trigger conflicts that might result in serious injury or death for members on both sides. The stakes of these interactions were always high, and the margin for error was virtually non-existent. Law enforcement pressure added another layer of complexity to every decision. Federal agencies like the ATF and FBI had made it clear that they viewed outlaw motorcycle clubs as ongoing criminal enterprises rather than legitimate organizations. This meant that perfectly legal activities could be viewed with suspicion and scrutinized for potential criminal connections. Club meetings, rides, and social events all had to be planned with the assumption that law enforcement might be watching. The pressure extended to individual members as well. Traffic stops became opportunities for police to gather intelligence about club activities. Members found themselves under surveillance, with their movements tracked and their associates identified. Some members were approached by law enforcement officers, hoping to turn them into informants. The constant pressure created an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that Lil Dave had to manage carefully to prevent it from destroying the club from within. Prison was always a possibility for club leaders and members. Many Mongols found themselves facing charges for everything from minor drug offenses to serious violent crimes. Lil Dave himself served time, an experience that gave him credibility with members who valued toughness and the ability to handle whatever consequences came with the outlaw lifestyle. His willingness to accept responsibility and serve his time without complaint reinforced his position as a leader who wouldn't ask his members to take risks he wasn't willing to take himself. But what Lil Dave didn't realize was that every interaction with law enforcement, every conversation with federal agents, every attempt to manage conflicts diplomatically was being watched and recorded by people who would later use these very efforts against him. The federal government was building a case that would threaten not just individual members, but the entire existence of the organization. The federal noose tightens. The federal government's interest in the Mongols didn't develop overnight. What began as routine monitoring of a regional motorcycle club gradually evolved into one of the most extensive and prolonged investigations in the history of outlaw motorcycle club enforcement. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives took the lead, dedicating enormous resources to understanding and ultimately dismantling what they viewed as a criminal organization masquerading as a motorcycle club. The investigation that would eventually threaten the very existence of the Mongols began with small-scale operations focused on individual members suspected of specific crimes. Drug dealers, weapons traffickers, and suspected participants in violent crimes found themselves under surveillance and investigation. What law enforcement agencies began to notice was a pattern. Many of these criminals were also Mongols members, and their illegal activities seemed to be coordinated through club structures and relationships. Federal investigators developed a theory that would drive their approach for more than a decade. The Mongols weren't just a motorcycle club whose members happened to commit crimes, but rather a criminal organization that used the motorcycle club structure to facilitate and conceal illegal activities. This distinction was crucial because it opened the door to using powerful federal laws designed to combat organized crime. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, commonly known as RICO, became the primary weapon in the federal arsenal against the Mongols. Originally created to fight the mafia and other traditional organized crime groups, RICO allows prosecutors to charge individuals not just for specific crimes they committed, but for participating in a pattern of racketeering activity as part of a criminal enterprise. For outlaw motorcycle clubs, this meant that being a member could potentially be treated as participation in a criminal conspiracy. Building a RICO case requires extensive evidence of an ongoing criminal enterprise, which meant that federal investigators needed to document not just individual crimes, but the organizational structure that allegedly facilitated those crimes. This requirement led to years of surveillance, wiretapping, and infiltration efforts designed to understand how the Mongols operated from the inside. Undercover operations became a central component of the investigation. ATF agents spent months or even years building false identities and working their way into the confidence of Mongols members. These operations were dangerous and complex, requiring agents to participate in club activities while secretly gathering evidence of criminal behavior. The psychological toll on undercover agents was enormous, as they had to maintain their false identities while witnessing and sometimes participating in illegal activities. The scope of surveillance was breathtaking, Phone conversations were recorded, text messages were monitored, and email communications were analyzed. Physical surveillance teams tracked the movements of club leaders and members. Financial records were scrutinized for evidence of money laundering and unexplained income. Even social media posts and photographs were collected and analyzed for evidence of criminal activity. This level of investigation required coordination between multiple federal agencies as well as state and local law enforcement. The complexity of managing such a large-scale operation while maintaining security and preventing leaks was enormous. Hundreds of law enforcement personnel were involved in various aspects of the investigation over the years it took to build the case. The human cost of this extended investigation was significant for everyone involved. Mongols members and their families lived under constant surveillance, never knowing when they might be arrested or when their homes might be raided. The stress of this situation took a toll on relationships and mental health throughout the organization. Some members left the club rather than continue living under such pressure, while others became increasingly paranoid and suspicious of anyone who might be cooperating with law enforcement. For the federal agents involved, the investigation became a consuming obsession that dominated their professional lives. Agent John Sun, who would later become a central figure in the controversy surrounding Lil Dave, spent years of his career focused almost exclusively on the Mongols. The depth of his knowledge about the organization and its members was both an asset to the investigation and, ultimately, a source of complications that no one could have anticipated. Little did anyone know that this extensive investigation would eventually create the conditions for the club's most devastating betrayal. Not from an undercover agent or turned informant, but from within the organization itself, triggered by personal relationships gone wrong. The relationship that changed everything: Lil Dave and Agent Sun. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, few relationships are as complex and potentially dangerous as those between club leaders and the law enforcement agents assigned to investigate them. The relationship between Lil Dave and ATF agent John Sun evolved over years of investigation and surveillance into something that defied easy categorization. What began as a typical adversarial relationship between a criminal suspect and a federal agent gradually developed into something more complicated, ultimately becoming the source of accusations and suspicions that would destroy Lil Dave's leadership and threaten his life. Agent Sun had been investigating outlaw motorcycle clubs for most of his career, but the Mongols case became his specialty and in many ways his obsession. He studied the organization with the intensity of an academic researcher, learning not just about their criminal activities, but about their culture, traditions, and internal dynamics. His knowledge of the club was encyclopedic, extending to details about individual members' personalities, family relationships, and personal histories. This deep knowledge made Sun incredibly effective as an investigator, but it also created an unusual dynamic in his interactions with club members, particularly Lil Dave. Unlike other law enforcement officers who treated all Mongols members as criminals to be arrested, Sun developed what he described as a professional respect for the organizational aspects of the club and for Lil Dave's leadership abilities. The relationship between the two men developed gradually over years of encounters at various motorcycle events, court proceedings, and during the execution of search warrants. What started as grudging mutual respect evolved into something that resembled a professional relationship between adversaries who understood and even appreciated each other's skills and dedication to their respective causes. Lil Dave recognized that Sun was different from other federal agents. Where most law enforcement officers treated him with barely concealed contempt, Sun maintained a professional demeanor that acknowledged Lil Dave's intelligence and organizational abilities. This respectful treatment was unusual enough to be noteworthy in the outlaw motorcycle world, where most interactions with law enforcement were characterized by mutual hostility. For his part, Sun found in Lil Dave a subject worthy of his professional attention. The Mongols' leader's ability to maintain discipline and loyalty within a large, geographically dispersed organization impressed the agent, even as he worked to gather evidence that would ultimately be used to prosecute that same organization. Sun understood that dismantling the Mongols would require more than just arresting individual members for specific crimes. It would require understanding and disrupting the leadership structure that held the organization together. The practical benefits of their unusual relationship became apparent during various incidents where violence might have erupted between club members and law enforcement. Sun could communicate directly with Lil Dave to defuse potentially dangerous situations, and Lil Dave could use these communications to demonstrate to his members that he was capable of protecting the club's interests through negotiation, rather than just confrontation. These interactions served both men's interests, but also created the foundation for future problems. In the insular world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, any regular communication between a club leader and a federal agent was inherently suspicious. Members who observed these interactions but weren't privy to their content naturally wondered what was being discussed and whether their leader might be sharing information with law enforcement. Lil Dave was dealing with increasing suspicion from club members who wondered whether his communications with law enforcement were appropriate for a club leader. Neither man fully understood how their relationship was being perceived by others until it was too late to address the growing concerns. What they viewed as professional communication based on mutual respect, others saw as evidence of inappropriate cooperation. The ambiguous nature of their interactions left room for interpretation, and in the paranoid world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, the worst possible interpretations often gained credence. What nobody realized was that this relationship, built on mutual professional respect and practical necessity, would eventually become the weapon that destroyed both men's reputations and nearly tore apart one of America's most powerful motorcycle clubs. The trial that shook the motorcycle world.
Boom, the raids hit. The 2008, the infamous Black Rain investigation, which you got to remember, we had undercover cops that have been in the club infiltrating for the last 3 years. Under Doc's reign. And there was 4 of them. It was ugly. They raided. Largo got taken in the raid, 79 defendants. And the whole premise behind these raids was not only to charge people. The charging indictment was obviously the 79 defendants. The icing on the cake was trying to steal the patch from us, the identities, the trademarks. The Mongol top rocker, the center patch with the image of Genghis Khan riding a motorcycle. That was trademarked. Well, what nobody really knew, Doc fucking threw those trademarks under Shotgun Productions and took the trademarks. Part of his bargaining plea agreement was to give the government the trademarks.
You're kidding me.
I'm not, dead ass serious.
So Doc took
yes
the Brotherhood's trademark and put it in his own private company?
October 30th, 2018 marked the beginning of what would become one of the most significant legal challenges ever faced by an outlaw motorcycle club. The federal courthouse in Santa Ana, California, became the battleground where prosecutors would attempt to prove that the Mongols Motorcycle Club was not a legitimate organization, but a criminal enterprise that deserved to be dismantled under federal racketeering laws. The scope of the charges was breathtaking in its ambition. Federal prosecutors weren't content to pursue individual members for specific crimes. Instead, they had constructed a case designed to attack the very existence of the organization. The indictment included charges related to murder, drug trafficking, weapons violations, and assault. But the most significant charge was the RICO conspiracy count that painted the entire club as a criminal enterprise. What made this case unprecedented was the government's attempt to seize the club's trademark and intellectual property as proceeds of criminal activity. The Mongols logo, a drawing of a figure resembling Genghis Khan riding a motorcycle, wasn't just a symbol to the club members, it was their identity. The government's position was that this logo had been used to facilitate criminal activity and therefore should be forfeited to the federal government like any other asset derived from illegal activities. Prosecutors argued that the patch and logo weren't just symbols of membership, but were actually tools used to intimidate victims and facilitate criminal activities. According to this theory, when a Mongols member wore the patch while committing a crime, the reputation and fear associated with the organization became part of the criminal act itself. For the Mongols, this wasn't just a legal challenge, but an existential threat. Losing the right to use their patch and logo would effectively mean the end of the organization as they knew it. Members who had tattooed the logo on their bodies would potentially be carrying illegal symbols. Clubhouses displaying the patch could be subject to seizure. The psychological impact of losing these symbols would be devastating to an organization built on tradition and shared identity. Lil Dave threw himself into the defense effort with the determination of a man fighting for his life. He worked closely with the legal team, headed by attorney Joseph Yanni, to develop a strategy that would challenge both the specific criminal charges and the broader legal theory being used to attack the organization. The defense faced an uphill battle against prosecutors who had spent years building their case and had virtually unlimited resources at their disposal. The prosecution's case relied heavily on evidence gathered through years of surveillance, wiretapping, and undercover operations. They presented recordings of conversations between club members discussing criminal activities, financial records showing unexplained income, and testimony from cooperating witnesses who had been members of the organization. The volume of evidence was overwhelming, creating a narrative that painted the Mongols as a sophisticated criminal enterprise masquerading as a motorcycle club. Particularly damaging were recordings that seemed to show club leaders, including Lil Dave, discussing criminal activities in coded language and making decisions about territorial disputes that resulted in violence. The prosecution argued that these conversations proved the existence of a command structure that directed criminal activity throughout the organization. The defense strategy focused on challenging the interpretation of this evidence and arguing that the government was conflating individual criminal behavior with organizational criminal activity. Yanni argued that while some Mongols members had undoubtedly committed crimes, this didn't prove that the organization itself was a criminal enterprise. Many legitimate organizations, he pointed out, had members who engaged in illegal activities without the organization's knowledge or approval. Throughout the trial, the relationship between Lil Dave and Agent Sun remained a subject of speculation and concern. Defense attorneys had to decide whether to call Sun as a witness, knowing that his testimony might reveal the extent of his communications with their client. The decision not to call Sun would later become a source of suspicion and controversy within the club. When the jury finally returned its verdict, the results were devastating for the Mongols. The organization was convicted on the RICO conspiracy charges, validating the government's theory that it was a criminal enterprise. The conviction carried not only criminal penalties, but also the potential forfeiture of the trademark and logo that was central to the club's identity. The $500,000 fine was significant but manageable for an organization that had members throughout the country. The real threat came from the civil forfeiture proceedings that would determine whether the government could seize the club's intellectual property. For the first time in American legal history, the federal government was attempting to essentially outlaw a motorcycle club by taking away its symbols and identity. But what Lil Dave didn't know was that his careful management of the defense strategy, including his communications with Agent Sun throughout the process, had created suspicions within his own organization that would prove far more dangerous than any government prosecution. When brothers turn against each other, the aftermath of the trial conviction created a pressure cooker environment within the Mongols' organization. Members who had spent years dealing with surveillance and harassment from law enforcement now faced the additional stress of potentially losing their identity as a club. The reality of the situation was that every time they wore their patches or displayed club symbols, they were potentially violating federal law. This legal uncertainty created fertile ground for suspicion and paranoia. Members began questioning every aspect of the trial and the decisions made by leadership during the legal proceedings. The fact that certain witnesses weren't called, including Agent Sun, became a source of increasing concern. Some members wondered whether these decisions were made for sound legal reasons or whether there were other factors at play. Lil Dave found himself in an impossible position. As the leader of the organization, he bore responsibility for the legal strategy that had ultimately failed to prevent the conviction. Members looked to him for explanations about why certain defense decisions were made and what steps would be taken to appeal the verdict and fight the forfeiture proceedings. The stress of leading an organization under this level of legal and financial pressure began to take a personal toll on Lil Dave. The weight of responsibility for the entire club's future, combined with the constant threat of additional legal action, created an enormous psychological burden. Members and their families looked to him for reassurance and leadership during one of the most difficult periods in the club's history. Complicating matters further was the ongoing relationship between Lil Dave and Agent Sun. Even after the trial, the two men continued to have occasional contact, ostensibly related to ongoing legal matters and appeals. However, in the paranoid atmosphere following the conviction, any communication between the club's leader and the federal agent who had led the investigation was viewed with deep suspicion. The situation was made worse by the fact that many club members didn't fully understand the nature of the communications between Lil Dave and Sun. Without complete information about these interactions, members were left to speculate about what was being discussed and whether these conversations were appropriate for a club leader to be having with a federal agent. Some members began to question whether Lil Dave had been completely forthright about his communications with law enforcement during the trial. The decision not to call Agent Sun as a witness began to seem less like a strategic legal decision and more like an attempt to conceal potentially damaging information about the relationship between the two men. These suspicions were fueled by the natural tendency of people under stress to look for explanations for their problems. The conviction and its aftermath were devastating to the organization, and members needed someone to blame. Lil Dave, as the leader, was a natural target for this blame, but the suspicions went beyond normal accountability and into more dangerous territory. The outlaw motorcycle club culture has little tolerance for cooperation with law enforcement under any circumstances. The concept of being a rat or informant is viewed as the ultimate betrayal, worse than theft, violence, or any other transgression. Even the suggestion that a member might have cooperated with law enforcement is enough to result in expulsion from the club and potentially physical violence. In this environment, Lil Dave's communications with Agent Sun became a source of increasing concern and speculation. Members who had once viewed him as an effective leader began to wonder whether his effectiveness had come at the cost of inappropriate cooperation with the enemy. The fact that he had maintained communications with Sun even after the conviction seemed to confirm the worst suspicions of his critics within the organization. The growing tension within the club created an atmosphere where every decision Lil Dave made was viewed with suspicion. His attempts to manage the legal appeals process were questioned. His communications with attorneys were scrutinized. Even routine administrative decisions about club operations became sources of controversy and debate. This internal conflict was exactly what law enforcement agencies hoped to achieve through their prosecution strategy. By creating pressure and suspicion within the organization, they could potentially cause the club to destroy itself from within, without the need for additional prosecutions or investigations. The success of this strategy became apparent as the Mongols began to tear themselves apart over questions about loyalty and leadership. What nobody knew was that the real explosion was still to come, not from law enforcement pressure or legal appeals, but from a personal betrayal so devastating that it would destroy everything Lil Dave had built in a single night. The night everything fell apart, Annie's revenge. Personal relationships in the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs are complicated by the constant pressure and scrutiny that comes with the lifestyle. The wives and girlfriends of club members must deal with the stress of knowing their partners are always at risk of arrest, violence, or worse. They live with the knowledge that their homes might be raided, their communications monitored, and their children potentially affected by their partner's involvement with the club. For Annie Santillan, being married to the president of the Mongols meant dealing with all of these pressures while also managing the additional responsibilities that came with being the leader's wife. She was expected to maintain a certain image within the club community, support her husband's leadership, and handle the family's affairs while he dealt with club business and legal problems. The stress of the conviction and its aftermath put enormous strain on the Santillan marriage. Lil Dave was consumed with managing the club's legal and financial problems, leaving little time or emotional energy for his family relationships. The constant pressure and uncertainty about the future created tensions that even the strongest marriages would have struggled to handle. Annie's discovery of her husband's infidelity came at a time when she was already dealing with the maximum amount of stress from the club's legal problems. The betrayal of trust represented by his cheating was magnified by the fact that she had sacrificed so much to support his leadership of the organization. She had endured years of scrutiny, harassment, and worry only to discover that he had been unfaithful during one of the most difficult periods of their marriage. The combination of personal betrayal and accumulated stress from years of pressure created a perfect storm of anger and resentment. Annie felt that she had given everything to support the club and her husband's leadership, only to be betrayed by the person she had sacrificed the most for. Her anger was not just about the infidelity itself, but about everything she had endured to support a man who had ultimately shown her such disrespect. Lil Dave's drinking problem made the situation even worse. Instead of dealing with the stress of the conviction and its aftermath in a constructive way, he had turned to alcohol as a way to cope with the pressure. This self-destructive behavior not only demonstrated poor judgment, but also made him vulnerable to making mistakes that could have serious consequences for both himself and the organization. The night of the recorded phone call, Lil Dave was drunk and emotionally vulnerable. The combination of alcohol and stress led him to say things that he would never have said under normal circumstances. His reference to Agent Sun's protection and the need for an exit strategy was exactly the kind of statement that could be interpreted as evidence of cooperation with law enforcement. But what Lil Dave said during that drunken conversation would pale in comparison to what Annie decided to do with the recording. Her decision to record this conversation represented a moment of pure anger and desire for revenge. She wanted to hurt her husband in the most devastating way possible, and she understood that in the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, nothing could be more damaging than accusations of cooperation with law enforcement. Annie's decision to share the recording with other club members was calculated to cause maximum damage to Lil Dave's reputation and position within the organization. But she didn't stop there. The text message calling him a rat was the nuclear option in the context of motorcycle club culture. Annie knew that this accusation would not just damage her husband's reputation, but would potentially put his life in danger. The text message was simple but devastating. In other words, he's a rat. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, there are no more dangerous words. Members of outlaw motorcycle clubs have been killed for less serious breaches of loyalty than being accused of cooperation with law enforcement. Her decision to take this step demonstrated the depth of her anger and hurt, but it also showed a lack of understanding of the potential consequences. Once the accusations were made public within the club, there would be no way to take them back or control how they were interpreted. The damage to Lil Dave's reputation would be permanent, regardless of whether the accusations were true or false. The irony of the situation was that Annie's actions accomplished exactly what years of federal investigation and prosecution had failed to achieve: the destruction of Lil Dave's leadership from within the organization. The government had spent millions of dollars and years of effort trying to dismantle the Mongols' leadership structure. But it was ultimately accomplished by a hurt and angry wife seeking revenge against her cheating husband. What happened next would shock even the most seasoned observers of motorcycle club politics and create a cascade of events that would destroy relationships, reputations, and lives. The expulsion. The process of expelling a member from an outlaw motorcycle club follows established protocols that are designed to ensure fairness and prevent hasty decisions based on temporary emotions or misunderstandings. These procedures are particularly important when dealing with accusations as serious as cooperation with law enforcement, since such charges can result in violence against the accused member if they are not handled properly. However, the emergency nature of Annie's accusations against Lil Dave created a situation where normal procedures were not followed. The combination of the shocking nature of the allegations and the existing tensions within the club following the conviction created an atmosphere where rational deliberation was difficult, if not impossible. The club's leadership called an emergency meeting to address the accusations. Under normal circumstances, such a meeting would include the accused member and would follow established procedures for investigating serious allegations. However, the explosive nature of the accusations and the fear that Lil Dave might be cooperating with ongoing law enforcement investigations created a sense of urgency that overrode normal procedures. The decision to hold the meeting without giving Lil Dave an opportunity to defend himself represented a fundamental breakdown in the club's internal justice system. For an organization that prided itself on loyalty and brotherhood, the failure to give their longtime leader a chance to address the accusations was a betrayal of their own stated values and principles. The recorded phone call provided what seemed like clear evidence of inappropriate communication with law enforcement. Lil Dave's references to Agent Sun's protection and the need for an exit strategy could easily be interpreted as evidence of cooperation with federal authorities. In the paranoid atmosphere following the conviction, club members were primed to believe the worst possible interpretation of these statements. Attorney Joseph Yanni played a crucial role in the expulsion process. His ongoing conflicts with Lil Dave over the handling of the trial gave him motivation to support the accusations against his former client. Yanni's legal expertise also lent credibility to the interpretation of the recorded statements as evidence of cooperation with law enforcement. The speed with which the expulsion was carried out reflected the depth of fear and anger within the organization. Members who had followed Lil Dave's leadership for over a decade were suddenly willing to cast him out based on accusations that had not been thoroughly investigated or verified. The emotional impact of believing that their leader had betrayed them overwhelmed their rational judgment and their loyalty to a man who had served the organization faithfully for many years. The formal expulsion process involved stripping Lil Dave of his patch and removing him from all positions of authority within the organization. More significantly, it involved declaring him persona non grata within the entire motorcycle club community. This action effectively made him an outcast from the only community where he had found acceptance and purpose for most of his adult life. The psychological impact of expulsion from an outlaw motorcycle club cannot be overstated. For members who have built their entire identity around their participation in the organization, being cast out represents a form of social death. All of the relationships, activities, and sense of purpose that come with club membership are suddenly stripped away, leaving the expelled member isolated and adrift. For Lil Dave, the expulsion was particularly devastating because it came after he had dedicated more than 2 decades of his life to building and leading the organization. His entire adult identity was wrapped up in being a Mongol, and particularly in being the leader of the Mongols. The sudden loss of this identity left him without a clear sense of who he was or what his purpose in life should be. The timing of the expulsion also maximized its emotional impact. Coming in the aftermath of the conviction and during the ongoing appeals process, the loss of leadership removed Lil Dave's ability to continue fighting for the organization he had spent so many years building. He was forced to watch from the sidelines as others took control of the legal and political battles that would determine the club's future. The expulsion also had practical consequences that extended beyond the emotional damage. Lil Dave's extensive knowledge of club operations and his relationships with various legal and political contacts had been valuable assets in fighting the government's case. His removal from leadership eliminated these advantages at a time when the organization needed all the help it could get. Perhaps most significantly, the expulsion set a precedent within the organization that loyalty and long service could be discarded based on accusations and suspicions rather than proven facts. This development fundamentally changed the culture of the club and created an atmosphere where trust and security were replaced by paranoia and fear. But Lil Dave wasn't going to accept his fate quietly, and what he decided to do next would shock everyone involved and expose the truth about what had really happened. Fighting back, the legal battle for truth and reputation, the expulsion from the Mongols left Lil Dave in a unique and dangerous position. As a former leader of a major outlaw motorcycle club who had been accused of cooperation with law enforcement, he faced threats from multiple directions. Current club members viewed him as a traitor who deserved whatever punishment the criminal underworld typically reserved for informants. Law enforcement agencies saw him as a potential asset who might be willing to provide information in exchange for protection. Rather than accept his fate quietly or seek protection through cooperation with law enforcement, Lil Dave made the decision to fight back against the accusations that had destroyed his life. This choice required tremendous courage because it meant challenging the narrative that had been accepted by both the club and law enforcement agencies. By maintaining his innocence and demanding proof of the allegations against him, he was essentially calling his accusers liars and demanding that they provide evidence to support their claims. The legal strategy for fighting the accusations required a multi-pronged approach. First, it was necessary to challenge the interpretation of the recorded phone call that had been used as evidence of cooperation with law enforcement. The statements that seemed to indicate cooperation needed to be placed in context and explained in a way that showed they did not actually constitute evidence of betrayal. Second, it was necessary to demonstrate that there was no documentary evidence of cooperation with law enforcement. Federal agencies maintain detailed records of their relationships with confidential informants, including formal agreements, payments, and reports of information provided. The absence of such documentation would be strong evidence that no formal cooperation relationship existed. Third, it was necessary to provide alternative explanations for the communications between Lil Dave and Agent Sun that had aroused suspicion within the club. These communications needed to be shown to have legitimate purposes that did not involve the sharing of confidential information or cooperation with law enforcement investigations. The decision to fight the accusations rather than accept them or flee represented a calculated gamble with potentially deadly consequences. If the legal strategy failed and the accusations were accepted as true by both the courts and the criminal community, Lil Dave would be in an even more dangerous position than before. However, if he could successfully challenge the accusations and prove his innocence, he might be able to restore his reputation and possibly even his position within the organization. The legal proceedings that followed would provide a forum for examining the evidence against Lil Dave in detail. Unlike the rushed internal club proceeding that had resulted in his expulsion, the court hearings would follow established procedures for examining evidence and would provide opportunities for cross-examination and the presentation of contradictory evidence. The stakes of these proceedings extended far beyond Lil Dave's personal reputation. The outcome would also determine whether the Mongols organization could use claims about his cooperation to overturn their conviction and avoid the forfeiture of their trademark and identity. If the accusations against Lil Dave were proven true, it would validate the club's decision to expel him, but would also confirm that their former leader had indeed betrayed them. If the accusations were proven false, it would mean that the organization had destroyed one of their most effective leaders based on lies and misunderstandings. The complexity of the legal situation was increased by the fact that multiple parties had different interests in the outcome. The federal government wanted to maintain their conviction and prevent any challenges based on claims of prosecutorial misconduct or the use of tainted evidence. The Mongols organization wanted to overturn their conviction, but also wanted to avoid admitting that they had wrongfully expelled their former leader. Lil Dave wanted to clear his name and restore his reputation, regardless of the impact on other parties. What nobody expected was that the truth, when it finally emerged in federal court, would be more shocking than anyone had imagined. The truth emerges, testimony and evidence in federal court. Judge David Carter's courtroom became the arena where years of accusations, suspicions, and conflicting narratives would finally be subjected to rigorous examination under oath. The hearing that would determine the truth about Lil Dave's alleged cooperation with law enforcement brought together witnesses from across the spectrum of the case. Federal agents, club members, attorneys, and family members who had been at the center of the controversy. The testimony of ATF Supervisory Special Agent Susan Rachel provided the first crucial piece of evidence. Her unequivocal statement that Lil Dave was not a confidential informant carried significant weight because of her position within the agency and her access to all relevant records. Federal agencies maintain meticulous documentation of their relationships with informants because of the legal and financial obligations involved in these relationships. The absence of any such documentation provided strong evidence that no formal cooperation agreement existed. Agent Rachel's testimony was supported by similar statements from other law enforcement officers who had been involved in the investigation. Officer Omar Rodriguez, Deputy Ivana Fars, and Sergeant Jared Lewis all testified that their thorough searches of law enforcement databases had found no records indicating that Lil Dave had ever served as an informant or cooperating witness. This testimony was particularly significant because it came from officers representing different agencies and jurisdictions, providing independent confirmation of the same conclusion. FBI Special Agent Joey Talamantes added another crucial element to the testimony by addressing specific claims that had been made about Lil Dave's status in the investigation. His statement that Lil Dave was not an unidentified co-conspirator directly contradicted claims that had been used to support the accusations against the former club leader. This testimony helped to demolish the foundation of suspicion that had been built around Lil Dave's role in the federal investigation. One of the defense attorneys who had represented the Mongols during their trial provided insight into the communications between Lil Dave and Agent Sun that had aroused so much suspicion. Stubbs confirmed that Lil Dave had told him about meeting with Sun, but characterized these communications as efforts to manage tensions and prevent violence rather than information sharing or cooperation with the investigation. This testimony was crucial because it provided a legitimate explanation for the communications that had been interpreted as evidence of cooperation. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, preventing violence through communication with law enforcement can be seen as responsible leadership rather than betrayal, especially when it protects club members from potential harm. But the most dramatic testimony came from Annie Santillan herself, who recanted her previous accusations against her husband. Her admission that she had lied about Lil Dave being an informant because she was angry about his infidelity provided a clear explanation for the origin of the accusations that had destroyed his leadership. This testimony was particularly powerful because Annie had been the original source of the accusations and had no obvious motivation to lie in court to protect her estranged husband. Annie's testimony revealed the human drama that had been hidden behind the legal and organizational conflicts. Her description of the emotional pain and anger that had led her to make false accusations helped explain how personal relationships and family conflicts had become entangled with serious criminal allegations. The fact that she was willing to admit publicly that she had lied demonstrated both the strength of the evidence supporting Lil Dave's innocence and her recognition of the serious consequences her actions had caused. The testimony about the recorded phone call that had been central to the accusations required careful analysis to separate inflammatory language from actual evidence of cooperation. Expert witnesses and attorneys helped explain how statements made during emotional, alcohol-influenced conversations could be misinterpreted when taken out of context. The references to protection and exit strategies that had seemed so damning were shown to have alternative explanations that did not require assuming cooperation with law enforcement. Agent Sun's own testimony, when it finally came, provided additional confirmation that no cooperation relationship existed. His description of his communications with Lil Dave emphasized the professional rather than conspiratorial nature of their interactions. While acknowledging that he had developed a working relationship with the club leader, he denied that this relationship involved the sharing of confidential information or cooperation with the investigation. The cumulative effect of all this testimony was to create a clear picture that contradicted the accusations that had destroyed Lil Dave's leadership. Multiple independent sources confirmed that no evidence existed to support claims that he had cooperated with law enforcement. The original source of the accusations admitted that she had lied. Alternative explanations were provided for the communications and statements that had aroused suspicion. What emerged from the courtroom was a tragic story of an organization that had destroyed one of its most effective leaders based on false accusations, personal vendettas, and misunderstandings that could have been avoided if cooler heads had prevailed. Justice delayed but not denied. The court's decision. Judge Carter faced an extraordinarily complex situation in evaluating the evidence presented during the hearing. The accusations against Lil Dave had triggered a chain of events that affected not only his personal life, but also the legal status of an entire organization and the validity of a major federal prosecution. The judge needed to determine not just whether the accusations were true, but also what legal consequences should follow from his findings. The standard of evidence required for different aspects of the case added to the complexity of the judge's task. For the Mongols' organization to succeed in their claim that prosecutorial misconduct had occurred, they would need to prove not just that Lil Dave had been an informant, but that the government had used information from him inappropriately and had failed to disclose this relationship to the defense. For Lil Dave to clear his name, he needed to prove that the accusations against him were false. The judge's analysis of the testimony and evidence was thorough and methodical. He examined each piece of evidence that had been used to support the accusations against Lil Dave and evaluated whether it actually supported the conclusions that had been drawn from it. The recorded phone call was analyzed in detail, with careful attention to the context in which the statements were made and the various ways they could be interpreted. The testimony from federal agents was given significant weight because of their professional obligations to maintain accurate records and their lack of obvious motivation to lie about whether Lil Dave had been an informant. The consistency of their testimony across multiple agencies and jurisdictions strengthened the credibility of their statements. Annie's recantation of her accusations was evaluated carefully, with attention to her motivations for both making the original accusations and later admitting they were false. The judge had to determine whether her court testimony was more credible than her original accusations, taking into account the emotional circumstances surrounding both statements. The judge's decision that insufficient evidence existed to prove that Lil Dave had been a government informant was based on the complete absence of documentation that would be expected to exist if such a relationship had existed. Federal agencies maintain detailed records of their relationships with informants for legal and administrative reasons, and the absence of any such records provided strong evidence that no formal cooperation had occurred. However, the judge's decision was carefully worded to avoid completely exonerating Lil Dave or completely condemning the Mongols for their actions in expelling him. The decision focused on the legal question of whether enough evidence existed to overturn the organization's conviction based on claims of prosecutorial misconduct, rather than making broader judgments about the personal or organizational conflicts involved. The denial of a new trial for the Mongols meant that their conviction would stand and that the forfeiture proceedings against their trademark and logo would continue. This outcome represented a victory for the government's prosecution strategy and confirmed that the evidence presented during the original trial was sufficient to support the conviction regardless of questions about Lil Dave's alleged cooperation. For Lil Dave personally, the judge's decision provided partial vindication by confirming that no evidence existed to support the accusations that had destroyed his leadership. However, this legal vindication came too late to restore his position within the organization or repair the relationships that had been damaged by the controversy. The decision also highlighted the tragic nature of the entire situation. An organization had destroyed one of its most effective leaders based on accusations that proved to be unfounded. Personal conflicts and family problems had been allowed to interfere with rational decision-making, resulting in consequences that harmed everyone involved. The Mongols' organization found themselves in the position of having expelled a leader who had not actually betrayed them, while still facing the legal and financial consequences of their conviction. They had lost the benefit of his leadership during one of the most difficult periods in their history based on false accusations and misunderstandings. For Lil Dave, the vindication was bittersweet. While his reputation had been legally cleared, the damage to his personal relationships and his position within the motorcycle club community was irreversible. The organization he had dedicated his life to building and leading had cast him out based on lies, and there was no way to undo that betrayal or restore what had been lost. The case stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal conflicts and emotions to override rational judgment, especially in high-stakes situations where reputations, livelihoods, and even lives hang in the balance. It demonstrates how quickly decades of loyalty and service can be destroyed by false accusations, and how difficult it can be to repair the damage once it has been done, even when the truth finally emerges. The story of Lil Dave and the Mongols serves as a reminder that sometimes the most devastating attacks come not from external enemies, but from within, and that the bonds of brotherhood and loyalty that hold organizations together can be more fragile than they appear.